Puck Buddies, a holiday sports rom-com featuring a one-night stand, secret feelings, and very questionable mistletoe decisions. Hearts on Ice Book 3 by Win Valentine. Copyright 2025 by Win Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Win Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book.
Chapter 1, Operation Cupmas Kickoff. The spreadsheet stared back at Grace like a rainbow of doom. Each color-coded tab representing another moving piece of the Cupmas party puzzle that seemed to multiply every time she blinked. Red for critical issues, yellow for pending approvals, green for content creation schedule, and an alarming shade of orange for things that will probably go wrong, but I can't control them. She pressed her pen harder against the paper, scribbling notes in margins that were already cramped with her tiny, precise handwriting. The media room at Keller Arena had become her unofficial headquarters for the past 3 days, mainly because it was the only place quiet enough to think and close enough to the coffee machine to sustain her caffeine-dependent planning process. Victor's holiday mic crackled from its charging station in the corner, sending a sharp burst of feedback through the room that made Grace wince and nearly knocked over her color-coded pen collection. She grabbed her red pen, the one reserved for urgent issues, and scrawled "Fix Audio Biddings" across the top of her technical requirements list. The mic had been Mira's idea naturally, something about elevated engagement and mascot holiday activation. Grace had tried to explain that wireless mics were notoriously unreliable in spaces with this much metal and electronic equipment, but Mira had waved her off with something about trusting the universe and festive energy solutions. Grace was beginning to suspect that Mira's approach to event planning involved more cosmic optimism than actual logistics. She was deep in cross-referencing catering head counts with venue capacity when the door burst open with a kind of dramatic flair that could only mean one person. The Grace, my organizational goddess, Mira sailed into the room wearing candy cane earrings so large they could probably be seen from the upper deck, and a sweater that looked like someone had detonated a glitter bomb shaped like snowflakes. She clutched her ever-present clipboard against her chest like a shield. I have the most amazing news. Grace looked up from her spreadsheet, already feeling a familiar sense of impending chaos. Did the catering confirm they can handle the dietary restrictions? Because I'm still waiting on. Even better! Mira dropped into the chair across from Grace with enough enthusiasm to make her earrings jingle like actual sleigh bells. I'm promoting you to co-captain of Operation Cupmas. Co-captain of what now? Grace's pen hovered over her notes, caught between finishing her thought and processing whatever Mira had just announced. You're the only person on this entire team who color codes things properly, Mira continued, gesturing wildly at Grace's carefully organized workspace. Do you know how rare that is? How beautiful? I looked at your content schedule yesterday and I literally got emotional. It was so structured. Grace felt heat creep up her neck. She was proud of her organizational skills, but hearing them described like some kind of miraculous talent made her feel both flattered and slightly ridiculous. Mira, I appreciate that, but I'm already drowning in social media content schedules. I have 17 different posting templates to finalize, and the engagement metrics from last week's Victor the Viper holiday content are still, which is exactly why this is perfect. Mira waved her clipboard dismissively, as if Grace's concerns were mere details to be swept away by the force of her enthusiasm. The Cupmas party needs someone who understands digital synergy and brand cohesion. someone who can translate my vision into actionable content strategies that drive meaningful engagements across multiple platforms while maintaining thematic consistency. Grace stared at her, trying to parse what any of that actually meant in practical terms. Are you saying you want me to handle the social media for the party? I'm saying I want you to handle everything for the party, Mira corrected, leaning forward with the intensity of someone sharing state secrets. Content coordination, crisis management, the whole festive package. You and me co captains, steering this ship toward maximum holiday joy. I don't think that's how ships work. Grace. Mira's voice took on the kind of gentle firmness usually reserved for talking someone off a ledge. I've been planning events for 3 years, and I've never found someone who understands both the big picture and the tiny details. You see the forests and the trees, and probably the individual pine needles. I need that kind of precision in my life. Before Grace could formulate a response that wouldn't sound like either false modesty or outright panic, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the media room. She glanced toward the door and immediately regretted it. Theo appeared in the doorway like some kind of festive fever dream, wearing a sweater that featured an actual blinking reindeer nose right in the center of his chest. His dark curls were slightly messed from practice, sticking up in ways that suggested he'd either been running his hands through his hair or had just pulled off his helmet. The sweater was objectively ridiculous, the kind of thing that should have made him look like a walking Christmas decoration. Instead, it somehow made his smile more devastating. Grace's pen hovered mid-word as she tried very hard not to stare at the way the blinking red light cast intermittent shadows across his face, or how the ridiculous snowman pattern seemed to make his eyes look darker, or how he managed to make even the most absurd holiday fashion look effortlessly charming. Hey, Theo said, his voice carrying that easy warmth that always seemed to fill whatever room he walked into. Mira texted me something about emergency content creation and possibly reindeer. Perfect timing. Mira sprang from her chair with enough energy to make Grace wonder if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Theo Bianchi, meet your new Cupmas content creation team partner. My what now? Grace's voice came out slightly higher than intended, but Mira was already in full presentation mode, gesturing between them like she was conducting an orchestra. You two are going to film promotional content together for the party. Interviews, behind the scenes footage, maybe some fun holiday challenges, whatever strikes your creative fancy. Mira consulted her clipboard with the seriousness of someone reading battle plans. Your energy together is absolutely perfect for holiday engagement metrics. I can feel it. Grace felt her stomach execute what could only be described as a triple axel. I don't think that's necessary. I can handle the content creation on my own, and I'm sure Theo has better things. Actually, Theo said, and Grace made the mistake of looking directly at him as he grinned. I'm honored to be your content creation partner. This should be fun. The warmth in his voice made something flutter dangerously in Grace's chest, and she fumbled for her professional voice like someone searching for house keys in the dark. Right. Yes, it's strategically sound. From a brand perspective, synergistic even. Mira clapped her hands together with obvious delight. See? I told you the energy was perfect. Organic chemistry like this can't be fake. Grace wished very much that the floor would open up and swallow her whole, preferably taking her color-coded spreadsheets with her. Instead, she managed what she hoped was a business-like nod. When do you want to start filming? How about right now? Mira was already pulling equipment from a storage cabinet like a magician producing rabbits from a hat. Just something casual to kick things off. Theo can talk about team holiday traditions while Grace handles the technical stuff. 20 minutes later, Grace found herself crouched behind her tablet, trying to keep the camera steady while Theo sat in the chair across from her, talking about how the team always did a Secret Santa exchange and competed to see who could wear the most outrageous holiday sweater to practice. The blinking reindeer nose on his sweater pulsed in a steady rhythm that Grace found oddly hypnotic, casting ridiculous red shadows across his face every few seconds. She'd started the shoot with every intention of maintaining professional focus, but something about the way the lights made his expression shift between serious and playful was completely destroying her concentration. The tradition started when Keller's grandfather was coaching, Theo was saying, his hands moving expressively as he talked. Apparently, he showed up to practice one day wearing this sweater with actual jingle bells sewn onto it, and the guys couldn't stop laughing during drills. Grace nodded along, trying to frame the shot properly, but found herself getting distracted by the way Theo's enthusiasm made the whole ridiculous story sound genuinely heartwarming. She missed her cue to ask the follow up question Mira had suggested, then missed it again when Theo smiled directly at the camera. Grace, Theo's voice was gently amused. Everything okay over there? Fine. Grace's response came out too loud, echoing slightly in the media room. Just adjusting the lighting for optimal engagement quality. Maybe you should get a blanket sweater too, Theo suggested, gesturing to his reindeer nose. We could coordinate our holiday tech. The idea of wearing matching ridiculous Christmas sweaters with Theo made Grace's brain temporarily short. She fumbled her grip on the tablet, then overcorrected and sent her stylus clattering to the floor. Professional focus, she muttered, scrambling to retrieve the stylus while trying not to think about how Theo's laugh sounded like warm honey. Maintaining professional focus is key to quality content creation. Noted, Theo said, and she could hear the grin in his voice without having to look up from where she was crawling around on the floor. Should I tone down my devastating holiday charm for the next take? Grace straightened up, clutching her stylus and what remained of her dignity. Your charm levels are adequate for content purposes. Adequate, Theo repeated like he was testing the word. I'll take it. 2 hours later, Mira reviewed their footage with the intensity of someone discovering a new element on the periodic table. Grace sat beside her, watching their filmed segments and trying not to cringe at how obviously flustered she looked every time Theo smiled. This is incredible, Mira announced, rewinding a section where Grace had laughed at something Theo said about Victor the Viper's holiday costume. The chemistry is off the charts, completely natural, totally engaging. This is exactly what we need for the party promotion. Grace felt her face heat up. I think chemistry might be overstating it. We're just collaborating effectively. Grace, honey, Mira turned to her with the patient expression of someone explaining something very obvious. I've been doing this for years. I know authentic connection when I see it. You two have that spark that makes people want to keep watching. It's just professional rapport, Grace insisted, but Mira was already making notes on her clipboard. Which is why you're going to film together every day leading up to the party, different segments, various formats, really build that audience investment. Mira tapped her pen against the clipboard decisively. I'm thinking holiday trivia, behind the scenes tour, maybe some of those rapid fire question things that do well on social. Grace's stomach performed another gymnastic routine. Every day? Every day, Mira confirmed cheerfully. This is going to be amazing. That night, Grace sat cross-legged on her apartment floor, surrounded by the contents of her Cupmas binder. She'd added 2 new tabs, daily content schedule in her standard blue ink and Theo collaboration notes in what she told herself was a completely practical shade of purple. She could absolutely handle working closely with Theo Bianchi. She was a professional. She had organizational systems and color-coded contingency plans. The fact that he made her laugh didn't mean anything beyond good collaborative chemistry, and the way his ridiculous sweaters somehow made him more charming was just an observation, not a thing. Her phone buzzed against the coffee table, making her jump. The text was from Theo, which shouldn't have made her pulse quicken, but absolutely did. Hey, content creation partner, should I tone down the sweater situation for tomorrow's shoot? Don't want to be a distraction from your professional focus. Grace stared at the message, typing and deleting responses with increasing desperation. First attempt. The sweaters are fine, but maybe something less blinking? Delete. Too specific. Second attempt. Wear whatever you want. It's not a distraction. Delete. Too casual. Third attempt. Your wardrobe choices don't affect my ability to maintain professional standards. Delete. Too robotic. Finally, she settled on, the sweaters are fine, very festive. She sent it before she could overthink it further, then immediately regretted the ellipsis. Did that seem flirty? Was festive coded language? She was overthinking a text message about Christmas sweaters, which was probably a sign that she needed to get more sleep. Grace closed the binder and headed to her bedroom, mentally rehearsing talking points for tomorrow's shoot. She could discuss team holiday traditions without getting distracted by blinking reindeer noses. She could ask follow-up questions without missing her cues. She could absolutely, definitely, completely maintain professional boundaries no matter how many ridiculous sweaters Theo decided to wear. But she could handle this. As she settled into bed, her phone buzzed one more time. Another text from Theo. Festive is my middle name. See you tomorrow, Grace. Grace stared at the ceiling for a very long time after that, promising herself she'd keep everything strictly business while trying to ignore how her pulse had quickened when she read her name in his message. She could handle this. Probably.
Chapter 2, Hismus Cheer and Other Threats. Theo walked into Keller Arena that morning wearing what could only be described as a crime against fashion. The sweater Mira had delivered to his apartment the night before was neon green, not a subtle forest green, but the kind of electric shade that probably violated several laws of nature. Across the front, a cross, an eyed reindeer stared out at the world with what appeared to be existential dread, while its red nose blinked in a rhythm that suggested either festive cheer or an SOS signal. Perfect. The first victim was Bodie, who took one look at the sweater and physically recoiled. Jesus, Theo, what'd you do to deserve that? This, Theo announced, doing a little spin to show off the full effect, is peak holiday spirit. Mira personally selected it for maximum festive impact. Maximum retina damage, Jace called out from across the locker room, but he was already pulling out his phone to film. Dude, that thing could probably be seen from space. That's the point, Theo grinned, adjusting the sweater so the reindeer nose caught the light. If you're not temporarily blinded by my holiday cheer, I'm not doing it right. Ty shook his head, lacing up his skates. You realize you have to wear that thing on camera, right? Like where people will see you, where Grace will see me. Bodie added with a knowing smirk. Theo's grin faltered for exactly half a second before returning full force. Grace appreciates authentic team spirit. Sure she does, Bodie said, not buying it for a second. By the time Theo made his way to the media room, the sweater had claimed 3 more victims, 2 equipment staff and a janitor who'd actually stopped mopping to stare. The blinking nose was working overtime, casting little red shadows across the walls as Theo walked. He pushed through the media room door and immediately spotted Grace hunched over her tablet at the corner table, stylus moving in quick, precise strokes. She was wearing another Viper's polo, this one in deep purple, and her hair was twisted up in what he was starting to recognize as her serious work mode bun. The exact moment she looked up, Theo saw it happen. The careful professional mask she wore cracked just enough for him to catch a glimpse of the real Grace underneath. Her eyes went wide at the sight of the sweater, tracking from the neon green fabric to the blinking reindeer nose, and her lips twitched like she was physically fighting a smile. For about 3 seconds, she just stared. Then she caught herself, looked down at her tablet with laser focus, and started typing something that definitely didn't require that much concentration. Good morning, Grace, Theo said, settling into the chair across from her. The reindeer nose blinked cheerfully between them. Morning, she replied without looking up. Mira wants us set up by the tree backdrop in 5 minutes for the team holiday spirit segment. Copy that. He leaned back in his chair, watching her try very hard not to look at his sweater. So what do you think? Peak festive energy, right? Grace's stylus paused mid-stroke. She glanced up, made the mistake of looking directly at the blinking nose, and her composure cracked again. This time, she couldn't quite hide the smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She started, then seemed to remember herself. Very noticeable. That was the goal. Mission accomplished, she said dryly, but Theo caught the way her eyes kept drifting back to the sweater, like she couldn't quite believe it was real. 20 minutes later, they were positioned in front of the elaborate holiday backdrop Mira had constructed, complete with fake snow, twinkling lights, and an alarming amount of tinsel. Grace stood behind the camera, tablet in hand, while Theo faced the lens with his most professional hockey player expression. Okay, Grace said, consulting her notes. We're starting with your take on team holiday traditions, then moving into what makes this season special for the Vipers. Stick to the talking points we reviewed and... Got it, Theo interrupted, but he wasn't looking at the camera anymore. He was looking at Grace, who was adjusting the camera angle and had stepped close enough that he could catch a hint of her perfume, something warm and vanilla that made him want to lean closer just to breathe it in. And action, Grace said, stepping back behind the camera. Theo started with the scripted lines about team tradition and holiday spirit, but somewhere around the importance of giving back to our community, he found himself ad-libbing. Grace had moved closer to adjust the camera settings, her sleeve brushing against his arm as she made minute corrections to the angle. He felt her hold her breath when the contact happened, saw the way her hand steeled on the camera for just a heartbeat too long. The holidays are really about finding those perfect moments, Theo heard himself saying, completely off script now. The unexpected connections, the times when everything just clicked. He was looking directly at Grace instead of the camera, watching pink creep up her neck as she realized what was happening. She started making frantic gestures behind the camera, pointing at her tablet and mouthing script with increasing desperation. Sometimes the best holiday magic happens when you're not even looking for it, Theo continued, still holding her gaze. When someone walks into your world and suddenly everything feels a little brighter. Grace's face had progressed from pink to red, and she was now clutching her tablet like a shield while making increasingly dramatic hand signals that roughly translated to stick to the talking points or I will end you. She hissed, barely audible, the script. Right, he said, finally turning back to the camera, and that's why the Midland Vipers are proud to support local holiday charities. Cut, Grace announced immediately, setting down the camera. We need to reset for better lighting. The lighting looked fine to me, came Jace's voice from the doorway. Theo turned to see the rookie setting up his own recording equipment, grinning like Christmas had come early. Actually, looked like great chemistry to me. It's called professionalism, Grace said quickly, but Theo noticed she couldn't quite meet Jace's eyes. Is that what we're calling it? Jace asked innocently, adjusting his camera. Because I'm definitely getting some behind-the-scenes content out of this. The fans are going to eat this up. There's nothing to eat up, Grace protested, but her voice had climbed half an octave. We're creating promotional content about Team Holiday Spirit. That's literally my job. Uh-huh, Chase said, clearly not convinced. And the way Theo was looking at you during that whole unexpected connections bit was completely professional, Grace finished firmly. Theo found himself fighting a smile. Watching Grace try to maintain professional boundaries while obviously flustered was becoming his new favorite form of entertainment. Should we go again? I promise to stick to the script this time. Yes, Grace said immediately. Script only, no improvisation, no unexpected holiday magic, Jace added helpfully. Definitely no unexpected holiday magic, Grace agreed, shooting Jace a look that could have melted the fake snow. They reset for the second take, but Theo noticed Grace positioned herself farther from the camera this time, well out of sleeve, brushing range. The second take went smoothly. He stuck to the talking points. It hit all the key messages about community engagement and team spirit, and didn't once mention unexpected connections or perfect moments. Grace nodded approvingly when he finished. Much better. Very professional. See, I can follow directions when properly motivated. What motivation is that? She asked, genuinely curious. Not wanting to give you a stress migraine, he said, which was true enough, though not the whole truth. Grace's expression softened slightly. I appreciate that. This whole Cupmas thing has me run on caffeine and pure anxiety. Hence the emergency donut stash? Theo nodded toward her bag where he'd spotted the familiar pink pastry box. Those are for legitimate emergencies only, Grace said seriously, like if Victor's mic system dies or Mira decides to add interpretive dance to the event. Both seem entirely possible, Theo agreed. As if summoned by the mention of potential disasters, Mira appeared in the doorway with her clipboard and an expression of manic holiday cheer. How are we doing? Getting good footage, building that authentic connection I know you two have. The footage is very professional, Grace said quickly. Professional but engaging, Mira clarified, making notes. I want viewers to feel like they're seeing the real Vipers' family dynamics, the genuine friendships, the natural chemistry between teammates and staff. Theo caught Grace's slight wince at the word chemistry. We should wrap up this segment, Grace announced. I need to review the footage and make sure we have everything we need for the social media post. Perfect, Mira said. Same time tomorrow for the holiday trivia segment. And Theo, I love the sweater commitment. Really sells the festive spirit. After Mira left, Theo helped Grace pack up the camera equipment, careful to maintain appropriate professional distance. But when Grace bent to pick up her stylus, which had somehow ended up on the floor again, Theo moved at the same time, reaching for the same spot. They both froze, faces suddenly inches apart. Theo could count the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could see the way her breath caught as she realized how close they were. For a moment that felt suspended in time, neither of them moved. Then Grace jerked backward so quickly she nearly lost her balance. Better lighting, she announced to no one in particular. We definitely need better lighting for tomorrow. Right. Theo said, straightening up slowly. Lighting is very important. Grace was already gathering her things with the efficiency of someone fleeing a crime scene. I'll review the footage and send the edited versions to Mira, professional content only. Absolutely, Theo agreed, though he was still thinking about how she'd smelled like vanilla and looked at him like she was seeing him instead of just his reputation. An hour later, Theo wandered into the break room in search of coffee and found himself face to face with Grace's legendary donut box sitting on the counter. It was slightly more battered than usual, the pastry box pink faded to something more resembling salmon, but it was definitely the same emergency stash Grace carried to every media event. He really should have walked away, should have grabbed his coffee and left the donuts alone like any reasonable person would do. Instead, Theo found himself lifting the lid and staring at an assortment of donuts that looked like they'd been selected with the same military precision Grace applied to everything else. They were arranged by type: chocolate glazed, maple bar, something with sprinkles that hurt to look at directly. One chocolate glazed donut called to him. It was perfectly round, the glaze still shiny, looking like exactly the kind of comfort food someone might need after a morning of filming holiday content while trying not to stare at their coworker's ridiculous sweater. Before his better judgment could intervene, Theo grabbed the donut and took a substantial bite. It was exactly as good as it looked, sweet and soft with just the right amount of chocolate glaze. He was savoring the second bite when he noticed the bright pink sticky note attached to the inside of the box lid. "Do not touch Grace's Stress Donuts" was written in Grace's precise handwriting with what appeared to be multiple underlines for emphasis. Theo stared at the note, then at the half-eaten donut in his hand, then back at the note. This was not ideal. "Those are my emergency carbohydrates." Theo spun around, still holding the evidence, to find Grace standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and an expression of deadpan resignation that somehow made the situation approximately 10 times worse. "I can explain," Theo started, then realized there was literally no explanation that would make this better. "Actually, no, I can't explain. I saw donuts, I took a donut. I'm a simple man." Grace walked over to the counter and peered into the box, taking inventory. "That was my prime chocolate glazed. I've been saving it since yesterday." "I will buy you 12 replacements," Theo said immediately. "A whole dozen of just chocolate glazed, 2 dozen, however many it takes to restore the karmic balance of stress donuts." "So that's not how stress donuts work," Grace said, but Theo caught the way she was fighting another smile. "You can't just replace emergency carbohydrates. They have to be procured during the specific stress event that created the need." "So this donut was purchased during a particular crisis?" Theo asked, genuinely curious. "Victor's holiday mic settings," Grace said seriously. "It took 3 hours to convince him that the reindeer sound effects were not in fact improving team morale." Theo nearly choked on the last bite of donut. He wanted reindeer sound effects? Every time someone scored during practice. Grace's professional composure was definitely cracking now. Clip-clock sounds for assists, full jingle bells for goals. It was a lot. "That's amazing," Theo laughed, "and traumatic. This donut was definitely earned through suffering." "Exactly, so you can see why a simple replacement won't suffice." But Grace was definitely hiding a smile now, turning to fidget with her tablet so he couldn't see her face properly. "What if I throw in coffee?" Theo offered. "Good coffee, not breakroom sludge, as additional compensation for the stress donut violation." "I have a very specific coffee order," Grace warned. "I'm prepared to handle complex coffee requirements." Grace finally turned back to him, and Theo caught the full force of that almost smile she'd been hiding. It transformed her entire face, made her look younger and less like she was carrying the weight of the entire Viper's media operation on her shoulders. "Medium vanilla latte, extra shot, oat milk, 1 pump of cinnamon syrup," she said. "And it has to be from Cafe Clutch, not the chain place." "Capes Clutch, got it." Theo pulled out his phone to make a note. "Anything else? Specific cup material? Particular stirring technique?" "Oh, don't mock my coffee standards," Grace said, but she was definitely smiling now. "Some of us need proper caffeine delivery systems to function at optimal professional levels." No mocking intended, Theo said solemnly. I respect anyone with detailed beverage requirements, shows commitment to quality. Grace packed up the remaining donuts with the care of someone handling precious artifacts. She set the box down on the counter deliberately, a small act of rebellion against her own obsessive organization. Let someone else worry about emergency carbohydrates for once. I should get back to editing. These interviews don't turn themselves into social media gold. She was halfway to the door when Theo called after her. For what it's worth, the stressed donut was excellent. Whatever crisis caused its purchase, you have good taste in emergency carbohydrates. Grace paused in the doorway, looking back over her shoulder. Thanks. And Theo? Tomorrow's trivia segment. Maybe dial back the off-script charm. My professional composure can only take so much. After she left, Theo stood in the break room for a good 5 minutes, grinning at nothing and trying to figure out why the sight of Grace almost smiled and felt like winning something important. That evening, Theo was sprawled on his couch with takeout in his phone when Jace's latest Instagram post popped up in his feed. The rookie had been busy. The post was a short video clip from their morning shoot set to some upbeat holiday song Theo didn't recognize. The caption read, "Behind the scenes, Cupmas content chemistry is unreal. Viper Shocky. Holiday vibes." Theo clicked play, intending to laugh at whatever ridiculous footage Jace had managed to capture. Instead, he found himself watching a carefully edited compilation of moments from their morning, Grace adjusting the camera while Theo watched her instead of looking at the lens, the way she'd smiled despite herself at his ridiculous sweater, the moment they'd almost collided going for the stylus. The editing was actually sophisticated. Jason had caught all the small moments Theo hadn't even realized were happening. The way Grace's face softened when he made her laugh, the completely natural way they moved around each other despite Grace's protests about maintaining professional distance. Theo watched it once, then found himself hitting replay, then again. By the fourth viewing, he was studying the footage like game tape, analyzing every expression and gesture. They did look natural together, even with Grace's determination to keep everything professional, even with his ridiculous sweater and her emergency donut stash. There was something easy about the way they interacted, something that felt less like work and more like possibility. Theo set his phone down and stared at the ceiling. It was just harmless fun, friendly coworkers getting along well enough to create good promotional content. Grace was probably mortified by the attention, probably already planning how to maintain even more professional distance tomorrow. But he couldn't stop thinking about the moment she'd almost smiled at his sweater that morning. The way she'd looked at him like she was seeing past the Theo Bianchi, who told jokes and wore ridiculous holiday gear to distract from anything real. He couldn't stop wondering what it would take to make her really laugh. Not the careful, professional smile she gave during filming, but the kind of laugh that made her forget about talking points and social media metrics and just be Grace. His phone buzzed against his chest, another notification from Jace's post. Apparently, the Vipers fans were eating up the behind-the-scenes content exactly like Jace had predicted. The comments were full of heart-eye emojis and speculation about holiday romance vibes. Theo turned his phone face down without reading anymore. Tomorrow he'd wear another ridiculous sweater and stick to Grace's talking points and pretend that watching her try not to smile wasn't becoming his favorite part of the day. Probably.
Chapter 3, Binder Full of Avoidance. Grace arrived at the media room at 6 a.m. sharp, armed with her largest coffee and a grim determination to impose order on what felt like an increasingly chaotic situation. The fluorescent lights flickered to life as she settled at her usual corner desk, laptop humming to life while she pulled up a fresh spreadsheet. Cupmas engagement metrics, vs. personal distractions, she typed into the header, then stared at the words with a mix of satisfaction and mortification. This was what her life had become, quantifying her feelings like they were click-through rates. She started with the safe categories first: projected video views, social media reach, fan engagement percentage, clean, professional metrics that made sense in the harsh light of morning productivity. Then she hesitated over the next column header before typing distraction incidents. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Yesterday alone, she could count at least 4 moments where Theo's presence had derailed her focus. The sweater comment, the donut theft, the way he'd looked at her during the trivia segment, and that moment in the break room when he'd complimented her emergency carbohydrate selection with what felt like genuine fondness rather than his usual teasing. Grace typed 4 into the cell, then immediately deleted it and typed 3, then deleted that too, quantifying how often Theo Bianchi made her forget her talking points felt both necessary for professional development and deeply embarrassing as a life choice. She was debating whether almost smiling at inappropriate holiday sweaters counted as a measurable distraction when the media room door burst open with enough force to rattle the team photos on the walls. Base, perfect timing. Mira Patel breezed into the room like a glittery tornado, wearing candy cane striped leggings and dragging what appeared to be a large spinning wheel covered in red and green tinsel. I have the most brilliant addition to our Cupmas programming. Grace looked at the contraption with growing alarm. The wheel was decorated with holiday-themed sections, each one labeled with what appeared to be suggested activities. From her angle, she could make out phrases like holiday serenade, mistletoe magic, and something that looked suspiciously like Cupmas confessions. Mira, Grace said carefully, what exactly is that? Mistletoe roulette, Mira announced, setting the wheel up on its portable stand with the pride of someone unveiling a masterpiece. I got the idea from that viral TikTok about randomized team bonding. Nothing says holiday team spirit like a little organized spontaneity. Grace stared at the wheel in horror. Each section contained increasingly suggestive dares written in Mira's enthusiastic handwriting. Still a kiss, holiday cuddle, romantic snow angel demonstration, and what appeared to be 7 minutes in the equipment closet decorated with tiny hockey stick drawings. Mira, Grace scrambled for diplomatic phrasing. This seems unprofessional and potentially problematic for workplace dynamics. We can't have players participating in randomized romantic activities. There are liability concerns, HR implications, basic boundaries of appropriate. Oh, don't worry, Mira waved off her concerns with a jingle of Christmas light earrings. We'll test it first to make sure everything runs smoothly, quality control just like you're always talking about. Before Grace could protest further, Mira gave the wheel a theatrical spin. The colorful sections blurred together as it whirred around, tinsel sparkling in the fluorescent lights, while Grace silently prayed for it to land on something harmless like sing carols or discuss favorite holiday memories. The wheel began to slow, clicking past holiday high five and festive compliment exchange before settling definitively on kiss your Cupmas crush. Grace's stomach plummeted somewhere in the vicinity of her shoes. Perfect. Mira clapped her hands together with delight. Now we just need someone to test it with. Without waiting for Grace's input, she called toward the open door. Theo, could you come in here for a moment? No, wait, that's not. Grace started, but Theo was already appearing in the doorway, wearing what had to be his most ridiculous sweater yet, a bright red monstrosity featuring Santa Claus riding a hockey stick through a starry night sky, complete with LED lights that blinked in sequence. Morning, Grace. Mira. Theo looked between them and the spinning wheel with obvious amusement. Testing out new equipment? Mistletoe roulette. Mira gestured grandly at the wheel, and it landed on Kiss Your Cupmas Crush. So you two are our test subjects. Grace felt her face burn as hot as Theo's sweater. We can't just. There are protocols for this kind of thing. Quality control procedures. We need to assess the liability implications and develop proper safety guidelines before any testing occurs. Grace. Theo stepped closer, and his voice carried that same gentle teasing she'd heard in the break room yesterday. It's just research, right? The space between them seemed to shrink impossibly fast. Grace found herself looking up at him, noting details her professional brain cataloged against her will. The way his dark hair was slightly messed from pulling the sweater over his head, how one side of his mouth curved up in that crooked smile that made her forget her talking points. The fact that he smelled like coffee and something warm that might have been his shampoo. I should probably document the process, Grace heard herself saying, though her voice sounded strange and distant, for quality assurance purposes, to ensure proper implementation during the actual event. Right, Theo said softly, taking another step closer. Documentation. His hand lifted toward her cheek, thumb barely grazing her skin. And Grace's eyes started to flutter closed despite every rational thought in her head screaming about professional boundaries and appropriate workplace behavior and the 17 different ways this could damage her internship prospect. The touch was feather-light, tentative, and Grace found herself leaning into it before she could stop herself. Theo's face was close enough that she could see the Christmas lights from his sweater reflecting in his eyes, could feel his breath warm against her skin when he murmured her name like a question. Yo, are you guys testing the kissing booth without me? Jace's voice cut through the moment like a hockey puck through glass. Grace jerked backwards so fast she crashed directly into Mira's craft supplies table, sending ribbons and glue sticks cascading across the floor in a colorful avalanche. It was just quality control, professional assessment of Grace scrambled to right herself while grabbing at scattered supplies, her face burning with humiliation. We weren't testing anything inappropriate. This was purely for documentation purposes. Jace held up his phone with a grin. Relax, I wasn't recording yet, though if you want to run it back for content. No, Grace's voice came out higher than intended. No recording, no content, no kissing booths or roulettes or any kind of romantic randomization during workplace hours. She clutched a handful of ribbon to her chest like protective armor, pointedly avoiding Theo's gaze. I should reorganize these supplies for efficiency purposes and to prevent future documentation mishaps. Grace spent the rest of the morning aggressively coding craft supplies in the equipment closet, muttering about maintaining appropriate boundaries and focusing on deliverables while trying very hard not to replay the moment Theo's hand had almost reached her face. The ghost of his almost touch lingered on her skin like static electricity, making her hyper-aware of every sensation. Professional distance, she reminded herself, sorting glue sticks by size. Clear hierarchical boundaries. Focus on measurable outcomes and quantifiable engagement metrics. But every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the way Theo had looked at her in that suspended moment before Jace interrupted, like she was something worth stopping to notice, rather than just the intern with the overly detailed spreadsheets. By afternoon, Grace had regained enough composure to position herself behind the camera for their scheduled Viper's Holiday Spirit promo shoot with military precision. She'd mapped out optimal lighting angles, backup equipment positions, and a detailed shooting schedule that left no room for improvisation or moments of inappropriate proximity. Theo, please stand on the designated mark, she called from behind her camera setup, clipboard in hand. We need consistent framing for the holiday message segment. And remember, stick to the approved talking points about team unity and fan appreciation. Theo moved to his mark with exaggerated precision, hands clasped behind his back like he was reporting for duty. Yes, ma'am. Strictly professional holiday spirit only. Something in his tone made Grace look up from her viewfinder. He was wearing normal teen sweater today, no blinking lights or ridiculous graphics, but somehow managed to look just as distractingly handsome as he had in Santa riding a hockey stick. Maybe more so actually, because without the costume element, she had no choice but to focus on the way the sweater fit across his shoulders, or how he pushed his sleeves up to reveal surprisingly nice forearms. Grace forced her attention back to her camera settings. Lighting adjustment needed on the left side. Move 6 inches toward the backdrop for optimal shadow reduction. 6 inches toward the backdrop, Theo repeated, shifting position. How's this for optimal shadow reduction? Before Grace could respond, a large green blur crashed into frame from stage left. Victor the Viper had apparently decided to photobomb the background, but his enthusiastic entrance sent him careening directly into the tinsel-covered backdrop with the grace of a runaway Zamboni. The backdrop wavered, tilted, and began its inevitable descent toward the floor in a cascade of silver tinsel that sparkled like metallic snow. Grace lunged forward to save her equipment, but the backdrop was falling faster than she could move. Strong hands caught her arm, steadying her as she stumbled forward into the tinsel avalanche. Grace found herself pressed against Theo's chest behind the fallen backdrop, surrounded by shimmering silver strands that had created an accidental cave of privacy in the corner of the media room. Equipment secure? Theo asked softly, his hands still on her arms. Grace looked up at him, breathing hard from the adrenaline of saving her camera gear. They were standing impossibly close in their impromptu tinseled hideout, close enough that she could see individual Christmas light reflections in his dark eyes, close enough to notice that his cologne mixed with the distinct scent of artificial pine from the fallen decorations. Equipment's fine, she managed to say, though her voice came out shakier than intended. Theo's thumb brushed a piece of tinsel from her cheek with the same careful touch he'd almost used that morning. You okay? The question was simple, but something in the way he asked it, gentle and genuinely concerned rather than his usual playful teasing, made Grace's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. For a suspended moment, surrounded by fallen tinsel that caught the light like a private snow globe, she forgot about metrics and protocols and the 17 different ways this could complicate her professional development. She forgot about everything except the way Theo was looking at her, like she was someone worth catching when she stumbled, someone worth asking after with real concern in his voice. Grace tilted her face up toward his, lips parting slightly, and for one breathless second, she thought he might actually. Grace! Theo! Everyone okay over there? Mira's voice cut through their tinsel fortress like reality, returning in stereo. Grace jerked away so fast she nearly tripped over the fallen backdrop. Fine. Everything's completely fine. Just reassessing safety protocols for all future shoots. She emerged from behind the tinsel, looking like she'd been caught in a very small, very sparkly blizzard, pieces of silver decoration clinging to her hair and sweater. We clearly need better equipment security measures and improved mascot management procedures. And definitely more comprehensive personal space maintenance guidelines. That evening, Grace sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a fresh cup of coffee, creating 3 new binder tabs with the grim determination of someone building fortifications against her own poor decision-making. Equipment security, tab 1, complete with subsections for backup positioning, emergency protocols, and contingency plans for mascot-related incidents. Basket management, tab 2, including suggested movement patterns, designated photobomb zones, and safety briefings for all costume-wearing personnel. Personal space maintenance, tab 3. Grace stared at the empty document under the 3rd tab for a long moment, cursor blinking expectantly. How exactly did one create professional guidelines for not almost kissing coworkers behind fallen tinsel backdrops? What was the appropriate protocol for maintaining emotional distance when someone touched your face like you were something precious, rather than just the intern with too many spreadsheets? Her hand shook slightly as she typed. Maintain minimum 3-foot distance during all professional interactions. Avoid unnecessary physical contact. Focus on measurable outcomes rather than. She deleted the last part. Rather than what? Rather than the way Theo had looked at her like she was worth stopping everything to make sure she was okay, rather than how her heart had hammered against her ribs when he'd asked that simple question with such gentle concern. Grace closed the laptop and buried her face in her hands. All the binder tabs in the world weren't going to organize away the fact that she was developing feelings for someone who was absolutely unequivocally off limits. But at least she could try.
Chapter 4, Mistletoe Roulette. Theo arrived at the Cupmas party 20 minutes late, having gotten stuck in traffic behind what appeared to be a convoy of cars driven by people who had apparently forgotten how roads worked the moment December hit. He'd shaved twice, once because he'd nicked himself the first time while his hands were inexplicably shaky, and once again because the first attempt had looked like he'd been attacked by a particularly vindictive razor. The Christmas cheer sweater Mira had insisted on was already making him sweat in the overheated banquet room. The thing was a crime against both fashion and common decency, bright red with a sequined snake wearing a Santa hat, complete with actual jingle bells sewn into the design. Every step he took sounded like a one-man percussion section having a nervous breakdown. The reindeer room was packed wall to wall with teammates, staff, and enough glittery decorations to blind a small aircraft. Someone had clearly told the decorating committee that festive meant visible from space because every surface sparkled under lights that strove between red and green like a Christmas emergency. Theo scanned the room, ostensibly looking for somewhere to dump his coat, but really searching for Grace. He found her stationed behind what could only be described as a fortress of clipboards and tablets near the content capture booth. her hair pulled back in a bun that looked like she'd constructed it with engineering precision. She wore a Vipers branded sweater that somehow made red and green look professional, and she was frowning at her tablet with the intense concentration of someone defusing a bomb. Their eyes met across the room, and Theo felt his stomach do something that definitely wasn't hunger. Grace stared at him for a heartbeat longer than professionally necessary before quickly looking back down at her tablet, pink creeping up her neck in a way that made him want to cross the room and see if the blush extended past the collar of that perfectly pressed sweater. Instead, he accepted a cup of suspiciously strong cider from a passing teammate and tried to look like he belonged at a party themed around a hockey team mascot's holiday celebration, which, considering he was wearing a sequined snake, wasn't exactly a high bar to clear. Ladies and gentlemen, Vipers and honored guests, Mira's voice cut through the party chatter with theatrical fanfare that would have made Broadway proud. It's time for our Cupmas centerpiece event, Mistletoe, roulette. The team erupted into cheers and wolf whistles as Mira gestured dramatically toward a glittery wheel that looked like it had been bedazzled by someone with both access to craft supplies and absolutely no impulse control. The wheel was divided into sections with various holiday-themed dares written in gold glitter pen. Sing a Christmas carol, tell your crush how you feel, holiday dance-off, and Theo's stomach clenched as he spotted it, kiss your Cupmas crush. Come on, everyone gather round. Mira clapped her hands together, her candy cane earrings jangling with enthusiasm. Our first brave volunteer is, she looked around the room with predatory glee, Theo. A chorus of cheers and catcalls erupted from his teammates. Someone, definitely Jay, started chanting, Theo, Theo, and the rest of the team picked it up until the entire room was rhythmically shouting his name like he was about to attempt a game-winning goal instead of spin a wheel, covered in what appeared to be actual glitter glue. Theo made his way through the crowd, jingle bells announcing his every step, trying to ignore the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. It was just a silly party game. Whatever the wheel landed on, he'd do it, everyone would laugh, and life would continue as normal. He reached for the wheel, gave it a solid spin, and watched as the sections blurred past in a sparkly tornado of holiday chaos. The room held its collective breath as the wheel slowed, clinking past Holiday Dance-Off, spinning past Sing a Christmas Carol, and finally coming to rest on the section that made Theo's mouth go dry. Kiss your Cupmas crush. The entire team erupted. Cheers, whistles, and someone who sounded suspiciously like Bodie shouting, "Finally!" filled the air. But through the noise, Theo could hear his teammates starting a new chant, "Grace, Grace, Grace." He looked across the room to where Grace stood frozen behind her clipboard fortress, eyes wide with what looked like pure mortification. She clutched her binder against her chest like armor, shaking her head slightly as if she could somehow will herself to disappear into the sparkly backdrop behind her. If she stood, but Mira was already moving, crossing the room with the determination of someone who lived for this exact kind of chaos. Come on, Grace. Don't be shy. It's all in the spirit of Cupmas. I really don't think Grace started, but Mira had already latched onto her arm and was physically steering her toward the makeshift mistletoe station, an archway that someone had constructed from what appeared to be an alarming amount of plastic greenery and twinkling lights. Mira, seriously, this isn't, Grace protested, but her voice was lost under the enthusiastic cheering of their audience. Theo walked toward her slowly, his heart hammering so hard he was surprised the jingle bells weren't keeping time with it. Grace stood frozen under the plastic mistletoe, still clutching her binder, looking like she was calculating the exact probability of the ground opening up and swallowing her whole. He stopped in front of her, close enough to see the way her glasses had fogged slightly from the heat of the room, close enough to notice that she was breathing fast and shallow, like she'd just sprinted across the arena. "Just for show, right?" he whispered, reaching up to cup her face gently, his hands shaking more than they had any right to. Grace's eyes searched his face for something, reassurance maybe, or confirmation that this was all just part of the performance, but her voice, when she answered, was barely audible over the noise of their audience. "Right? Just for show?" Theo leaned down, intending to give her the kind of quick, performative kiss that would satisfy their cheering teammates and let them both escape with their dignity intact. Something light and brief and entirely forgettable. But the moment his lips touched hers, Grace made a tiny sound, barely a whisper of breath, that went straight through him like an electric shock. Her free hand came up to rest against his chest, fingers curling slightly into the ridiculous fabric of his sweater, and suddenly Theo was pulling her closer, forgetting completely about their audience. The kiss deepened, became something breathless and desperate and entirely too real. Grace dropped her binder, and Theo heard it hit the floor with a dull thud, but he was too lost in the way she was kissing him back, tentative at first, then with growing certainty, to care about anything else. And she tasted like cinnamon and possibility and something he couldn't quite name but wanted more of. Her hand slid up from his chest to the back of his neck, fingers tangling in his hair, and Theo felt something fundamental shift in his chest, like a door he hadn't realized was locked suddenly swinging open when they finally broke apart, only because breathing had become a biological necessity. They were both breathing hard. Theo could see something vulnerable and surprised in Grace's eyes, like she hadn't expected the kiss to feel like that either. Around them, their teammates were cheering and whistling and making the kinds of comments that would normally make Theo grin and take a bow. Instead, he couldn't look away from Grace's face, from the way she was staring at him, like she was seeing him for the first time. "We should probably," Grace started, glancing around at their grinning teammates, but the sentence died unfinished. The party continued around them, but it felt distant now, like they were watching it through glass. Theo could feel sweat gathering at his collar from more than just the overheated room and the sequined sweater. "Want to get some air?" he asked quietly, and Grace nodded so quickly she nearly knocked her glasses askew. Grace abandoned her binder station, something Theo was pretty sure he'd never seen her do voluntarily, and started to follow him through the crowd toward the exit. But she paused mid-step, turning back with a frustrated sigh. "I can't just leave everything," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Mira will kill me if the equipment goes missing." She hurried back to the content station, hastily shoving cables, her tablet, and what looked like Victor's wireless mic into an oversized Viper's tote bag. The mic was still clipped to its portable receiver, a small red light indicating it was powered on, though Grace was too flustered to notice. "Just grabbing the essentials," she said breathlessly, slinging the bag over her shoulder. "I'll sort it out tomorrow." Now she followed him through the crowd toward the exit. The December night hit them like a shock of clarity, their breath visible in small puffs as they walked across the parking lot toward his car, without discussing where they were going. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged with something Theo couldn't quite name. Grace walked close enough that their arms brushed occasionally, and every point of contact felt deliberately significant. "Your car?" she asked when he stopped beside his Honda Civic. "Not exactly the most romantic vehicle in the world, but it was reliable, and the heater worked." "Unless you'd rather call a ride," Theo said, fishing his keys from his pocket. "We could just drive around, or I could take you home, or—" "Your place," Grace said quickly, then blushed so hard it was visible even in the parking lot lighting. "I mean, if that's— I don't want to assume." Theo unlocked the car and held the passenger door open for her. "My place sounds good." The drive to his apartment was quiet except for the sound of the heater and the soft pop music playing from his phone. Grace stared out the window, occasionally glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Theo found himself taking the long way, stretching out these few minutes of suspended possibility before they had to figure out what happened next. In the elevator to his floor, Grace finally spoke. "What are we doing?" There was genuine confusion in her voice, like she was asking because she honestly couldn't figure it out. Theo hit the button for the fourth floor and turned to look at her. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't want tonight to end." The elevator dinged softly as they reached his floor. Theo reached for Grace's hand, half expecting her to pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, warm and sure. "Me neither," she said quietly. They tumbled through his apartment door, still kissing, Grace's hands tangled in the ridiculous Hisma sweater as she pulled it over his head, jingle bells scattering across his hardwood floor. The sweater caught briefly on his hair before finally coming free, and Grace laughed, actually laughed, at the static electricity that made his curls stick up at odd angles. "Better?" Theo asked breathlessly, and Grace's answer was to kiss him again, backing him toward the hallway that led to his bedroom. They moved slowly despite the urgency, pausing to kiss against the wall to let Theo slide Grace's sweater over her head and trace the line of her collarbone with his lips. When they finally made it to his bedroom, Grace sat on the edge of his bed and looked up at him with something that might have been nervousness or anticipation or both. If you want to stop. No, Grace interrupted, her voice steady and certain in a way that made his chest ache. I don't want to stop. Later, lying tangled in his sheets with Grace curled against his side, Theo traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder while she slept. Her hair tickled his chest, dark strands catching the light from the street lamp outside his window, and he could feel her breathing, slow and even against his ribs. Something fundamental had shifted between them, something that went deeper than attraction or convenience or holiday party momentum. Theo wasn't sure what happened next, wasn't sure what Grace would want when she woke up, or how they'd navigate whatever this was in the bright light of morning. But lying there in the quiet dark with Grace's warm weight pressed against him, Theo found he didn't want to think about tomorrow's complications. Instead, he let himself focus on the present, the soft sound of her breathing, the way her hand rested over his heart, the fact that she'd chosen to stay.
Chapter 5. Binder, Box, and Regret. Grace woke to the unfamiliar softness of expensive sheets and the scent of cedar mixed with something warm and distinctly masculine. For one blissful moment, she floated in that drowsy space between sleep and consciousness, registering only comfort and warmth and the steady rhythm of breathing that wasn't her own. Then reality crashed over her like ice water. Theo's apartment. Theo's bed. Theo's arm draped across her waist with casual possession that made her stomach flip with equal parts desire and horror. The memories hit in fragments. His mouth on hers beneath the mistletoe, the elevator ride with her hands fisted in his ridiculous sweater, the way he'd ask if she wanted to stop and how quickly she'd said no. Oh God, what had she done? Grace lay frozen, heart hammering against her ribs as she processed the full scope of her professional suicide. She'd slept with a player. Not just any player. Theo Bianchi, team favorite, Bodhi's best friend, the guy everyone loved, the guy whose easy smile and terrible jokes had been steadily dismantling her defenses for weeks. Beside her, Theo's breathing remained slow and even, his face peaceful in sleep in a way that made her chest ache. His curls were mussed from her fingers, and there was still a faint imprint of her lipstick on his jaw. He looked younger like this, unguarded, and Grace had to bite back a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. She needed to leave now, before he woke up and they had to have whatever awkward conversation awaited them in the harsh light of morning, before she had to see disappointment or regret in his eyes, before she had to explain why this could never ever happen again. Moving with painstaking care, Grace began the delicate process of extracting herself from Theo's loose embrace. His arm across her waist felt heavier than it should, and every small shift made the mattress creak in ways that seemed thunderous in the quiet apartment. She held her breath as she slowly lifted his wrist and slid out from beneath his arm, wincing when he made a soft sound and shifted toward the warm spot she'd vacated. Her dress lay crumpled on the floor beside Theo's discarded sweater, a tangle of dark fabric that made her cheeks burn as she remembered how it had gotten there. Grace grabbed it along with her bra and underwear, not caring about wrinkles as she pulled everything on with shaking hands. Her phone was on the nightstand and she clutched it like a lifeline as she crept toward the bedroom door. The living room felt cavernous in the early morning light, all exposed brick and minimal furniture that screamed bachelor pad. Grace spotted her purse by the front door and made a beeline for it, her bare feet silent on the hard wood. She needed to find her shoes, her coat, evidence of her presence that she couldn't leave behind like breadcrumbs. Her heels were kicked off somewhere near the couch, and Grace shoved her feet into them without bothering with the straps. Her coat was draped over a chair, and she wrapped it around herself like armor, suddenly desperate to be covered, protected, hidden. The front door seemed miles away, and Grace approached it like she was defusing a bomb. The deadbolt turned with a soft click that made her freeze, waiting for sounds of Theo stirring in the bedroom. When nothing came, she slipped through the door and closed it gently behind her, finally allowing herself to breathe. The elevator ride down felt endless, giving her mind too much time to replay every sensation from the night before. Theo's hands in her hair, The way he looked at her like she was something precious. The soft sounds he made when she kissed that spot just below his ear. Grace pressed her back against the elevator wall and squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the memories away. Teacher needed to get home, she needed to shower and change, and figure out how to salvage what was left of her professional reputation before anyone figured out where she'd spent the night. Grace's apartment felt like a sanctuary, all neutral colors and organized surfaces that reminded her who she was supposed to be: professional, ambitious, not the kind of person who made impulsive decisions that could derail her entire career trajectory. She caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror and stopped short. Her hair was a mess, dark strands escaping from what had once been a sleek updo. Her makeup was smudged, mascara creating shadows beneath her eyes, and her dress was wrinkled beyond repair. She looked exactly like someone who'd spent the night tangled up with the hockey player, and the evidence written across her reflection made her stomach churn. In the bathroom, Grace stripped off every piece of clothing and turned the shower as hot as she could stand. Steam filled the small space as she scrubbed at her skin with mechanical precision, trying to wash away the phantom sensation of Theo's touch. The water was almost scalding, but she welcomed the sting. Maybe if she could burn away the memory of how right it had felt to be in his arms, she could pretend it had never happened. She shampooed her hair twice, conditioned it until it squeaked, and used the expensive body wash she saved for special occasions, as if luxury products could somehow restore her to who she'd been 24 hours ago. When she finally stepped out of the shower, her skin was pink and raw, and she still felt the echo of cedar and warmth in her lungs. Grace blow dried her hair until it was pinned straight and pulled it back in the severest bun she could manage. She applied her makeup with clinical precision: foundation to cover the flush that seemed permanently etched into her cheeks, concealer to hide the evidence of a sleepless night, neutral lipstick that wouldn't remind her of how thoroughly Theo had kissed it away. Her most professional blazer came out of the closet, navy blue and structured enough to feel like armor. Beneath it, she wore a crisp white blouse buttoned all the way to her throat, conservative pants, sensible flats, her work bag packed with everything she'd need to prove that Grace Whitby was back to being a consummate professional. The drive to Keller Arena took longer than usual, early Sunday morning traffic giving her too much time to think. She left her apartment 40 minutes before she needed to be at work, desperate to bury herself in spreadsheets and content planning before anyone else arrived. The extra time would let her organize her thoughts, create new systems, build walls that would prevent this kind of catastrophic lapse in judgment from ever happening again. Grace had stopped at an office supply store on the way, purchasing a fresh binder that she'd already labeled Post Cupmas, Content Strategy, in neat block letters. It was thicker than her usual binders, with more dividers and pocket organizers, as if the extra structure could somehow contain the chaos in her head. The arena felt different in the early morning quiet, all echoing hallways and fluorescent lighting that made everything look stark and professional. Perfect. Grace made her way to the media room and spread her new materials across the conference table like she was preparing for battle. She was 3 color-coded sections deep into her revised content calendar when Mira bounced through the door, practically vibrating with post-party excitement. Yes! Oh my God, this morning is perfect timing. I have been dying to debrief about last night. Mira set down a coffee that smelled suspiciously like it contained enough caffeine to power a small aircraft. The mistletoe roulette was such a hit. I mean, obviously, we knew it would create moments, but that kiss? Everyone is still talking about it. Grace's fingers tightened around her pen until her knuckles went white. The engagement metrics were certainly strong, she managed, not looking up from her spreadsheet. I've pulled the initial data to analyze optimal content timing for future holiday events. Metrics? Mira laughed, sliding into the chair across from Grace. I'm talking about romance, chemistry, the way Theo looked at you when... Speaking of metrics, Grace interrupted, flipping to a fresh page with more force than necessary. I think we should focus on developing a comprehensive January content strategy. New year, fresh start. Emphasis on team performance rather than personal moments. Mira's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, but she leaned forward with interest. Okay, I can work with that. But you have to admit, the personal stuff really resonates with fans. They love seeing the human side of the players. That moment with you and Theo was so genuine and sweet. Professional boundaries are important, Grace said firmly, her voice coming out sharper than intended. We want to maintain the integrity of our content while avoiding potential workplace complications. Before Mira could respond, Jace appeared in the doorway with his ever present camera set up, grinning widely. Perfect, Grace. I was hoping to catch you early. Want to film a quick morning after party recap? I'm thinking something casual, maybe talk about the highlights, get your perspective on. Grace's tablet slipped from her hands, clattering against the conference table. No, she said quickly, too quickly. I mean, I think it's important to maintain professional boundaries. We should focus on deliverables instead of personal moments. Jace's eyebrows shot up. Personal moments? I was just thinking about content strategy and event planning stuff. Behind the scenes process, content. Heat flooded Grace's cheeks. Of course, I knew that. We have a lot of post event analysis to complete, and I want to make sure we're using our time efficiently. Right, Jay said, slowly, clearly picking up on the weird energy in the room. Well, if you change your mind, I'll be around. Just got some really interesting footage from last night that I think could make for some great reels. After he left, Grace buried herself in aggressive scheduling, creating new spreadsheets for everything she could think of: January content planning, professional development goals, quarterly analytics review, anything to keep her mind occupied and her hands busy. She pointedly avoided looking at the corner of the media room where she and Theo had almost kissed behind a pile of tinsel just days ago. That felt like a lifetime ago now, back when the worst thing that could happen was an awkward moment behind some decorations. Now she'd crossed the line so definitively that there was no going back. Halfway through reorganizing her digital files, Grace realized with a sinking heart that she'd left her emergency donut box at Theo's apartment. The pink pastry box that contained not just stress snacks, but also her passive-aggressive sticky notes about frosting judgment and morale emergencies. Physical evidence of her neuroses now sitting on some surface in his living space, probably next to his scattered jingle bells and the memory of what they'd done. The thought of him finding those notes, reading her ridiculous organizational systems laid out in sugar power detail, made her want to crawl under the conference table and disappear. She couldn't even send someone to retrieve it without explaining why it was there in the first place. Her phone buzzed against the table, and Grace glanced down to see Theo's name on the screen. Her heart stuttered as she read the message. Hey, you left in a hurry this morning. Are you okay? Want to talk? Grace stared at the text for a full minute, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She could imagine a dozen different ways to respond: casual and breezy, professional and distant, honest about the panic clawing at her chest. Instead, she picked up the phone, turned it face down, and slid it into her desk drawer without typing a single word. The afternoon passed in a blur of hyper-organized productivity. Grace created spreadsheets within spreadsheets, color-coded content calendars that planned 3 months ahead, and revised filing systems that would have impressed a corporate efficiency expert. She drafted an email to Mira suggesting they restructure content partnerships to avoid potential workplace complications, but deleted it after reading it twice. Too obvious, too specific, too much like an admission of guilt. She tried again with more generic language about maintaining professional standards and optimizing team dynamics, but that sounded even worse. After the third deletion, Grace gave up and created a new binder tab instead: professional boundary maintenance, as if having a labeled section for her personal failings could somehow contain them. By the time Grace returned to her apartment that evening, she'd convinced herself that the day had been a success. She'd maintained her composure, directed conversations away from personal topics, and created enough organizational systems to keep her busy for months. No one suspected anything. No one had questioned her sudden obsession with professional boundaries or knows how she'd avoided making eye contact whenever Theo's name came up in casual conversation. She spread her color-coded schedules across her coffee table and told herself that last night had been an aberration: holiday party madness, stress relief after weeks of event planning, a momentary lapse in judgment that could be compartmentalized and filed away under learning experiences or professional development opportunities. But her hands shook as she picked up a red pen and wrote "Never Again" in capital letters across the top of her Monday planning page. The ink bled slightly into the paper, making the words look harsh and final, like a command she wasn't sure she had the strength to follow. Grace sat back on her couch, surrounded by the evidence of her desperate attempt to rebuild her professional armor, and tried not to think about cedar-scented sheets or the way Theo had traced patterns on her shoulder while she fell asleep. She tried not to remember how safe she'd felt in his arms, or how disappointed he'd sounded in that text message she still hadn't answered. Instead, she focused on the red ink bleeding across her planner and told herself that some mistakes were too big to repeat, no matter how much her treacherous heart whispered otherwise.
Chapter 6, Sweater Confessionals. The blinking reindeer nose on Theo's sweater cast intermittent red light across the locker room as he laced up his skates, ignoring the collective groan from his teammates when they spotted his wardrobe choice. "Dude, Christmas is over," Jace called from across the room, adjusting the strap on his helmet. "You can retire the light show." It's January 3rd, added Marcus, shaking his head. "The holidays are dead and buried." Theo glanced down at the ridiculous sweater, where Christmas cheer blinked in alternating green and red letters while the reindeer's nose pulsed like a tiny heartbeat. He should have packed it away with the rest of the decorations. Should have moved on from the whole Cupmas disaster like a normal person. But every time he looked at the blinking lights, he remembered Grace's face when she first saw him wearing it. That almost smile she'd tried to hide behind her tablet. The way her eyes had lit up despite herself. But he wasn't ready to put that memory in storage yet. "Fashion is cyclical," Theo said, pulling his jersey over the sweater. "I'm just ahead of the curve." "You're ahead of something," muttered Bodie. But his tone was fond rather than annoyed. Practice passed in a blur of drills and scrimmages, the familiar rhythm of skates on ice providing a temporary distraction from the mess he'd made of things. But as soon as they hit the showers and Theo caught sight of the media room through the hallway windows, his stomach twisted into familiar knots. The media room felt different when Theo walked in afterward, still wearing the damp sweater because changing felt too much like admitting defeat. Grace stood at the far end of the room with her back to him, shoulders rigid as she organized equipment with surgical precision. Every movement was sharp and deliberate. Camera cables wound into perfect coils, tablets arranged in precise angles, backup batteries lined up like tiny soldiers. She had to know he was there. The blinking lights from his sweater were reflecting off the metallic equipment, casting dancing shadows on the wall beside her. But she didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't even pause in her aggressive organization. Theo's chest ached with the deliberate nature of her avoidance. 3 days ago, they'd been tangled in his sheets, her hair spread across his pillow while she traced lazy patterns on his chest. Now she couldn't even look in his direction. He cleared his throat softly, hoping for some sign of recognition. Nothing. Grace moved to the next table and began arranging microphone stands with the focus of someone defusing a bomb. "Grace," he said quietly, her name barely audible over the hum of equipment. Her shoulders tensed further, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she picked up her tablet and began typing with violent intensity, the tap, tap, tap of her fingers against the screen, filling the silence between them. Theo tried to think of something else to say, some casual comment that might bridge the gap without making things worse. But every potential conversation starter felt loaded with subtext, weighted with the memory of her soft sighs and the way she'd whispered his name in the dark. He was still standing there, paralyzed by indecision, when Grace glanced over her shoulder. It was barely a second, her eyes flicking toward him, lingering on his ridiculous sweater before she caught herself and whipped her head away so fast he wondered if he'd imagined it. But he hadn't imagined the way her typing became even more frantic, fingers flying across the screen as if she could delete the moment through sheer digital determination. She looked again a minute later, this time when she thought he was adjusting camera settings. Another quick glance, eyes catching on the blinking reindeer before darting away like she'd been burned. Her cheeks flushed pink, and she immediately busied herself with reorganizing equipment that was already perfectly arranged. The fact that she was looking at all gave Theo a tiny spark of hope. If she truly wanted to forget everything that happened between them, she wouldn't be stealing glances at his stupid sweater. She wouldn't be noticing the way the lights caught in the metallic surfaces around them. But before he could figure out how to turn stolen glances into actual conversation, Mira burst through the media room doors with her usual chaotic energy, clipboard in one hand and what appeared to be a bedazzled stopwatch in the other. "Perfect timing," she announced, surveying the room with satisfaction. "I need you two for a fan reaction reel about the Cupmas party highlights." Grace's face went pale. I don't think we already have enough content from the party. There's such a thing as oversaturation, and the analytics suggest nonsense, Mira interrupted, already moving equipment around to create an impromptu interview setup. The engagement on our Cupmas posts has been through the roof. Fans are obsessed with behind-the-scenes content. Natural chemistry sells, Grace. You know that. Natural chemistry. Theo caught Grace's wince at the phrase and felt his own face heat up. If Mira only knew how natural their chemistry had gotten. Mira, I really think we should focus on upcoming game content instead, Grace tried again, but she was already being guided toward the interview chairs with gentle but implacable force. 5 minutes, Mira said firmly. Quick reactions, fun highlights, team bonding, easy stuff. Jace appeared from somewhere with his camera already rolling, grinning as he positioned himself for the best angle. This is going to be great content, he said, adjusting his stabilizer. Everyone's still talking about mistletoe roulette. Grace's grip on her tablet tightened until her knuckles went white. The familiar weight of her binder felt suddenly foreign in her hands. All that careful planning and organization, and she still couldn't control the one thing that mattered most. She abruptly stood up, nearly knocking over her chair in her haste to escape. She set the binder down with uncharacteristic carelessness, abandoning her color-coded tabs and emergency schedules like they'd already failed her. Technical difficulties, she mumbled, not looking at anyone. Theo wanted to tell Jace to shut up, wanted to grab Grace's hand and tell her they could skip this, wanted to delete every piece of footage from that night and start over with a clean slate. Instead, he sat down in the chair beside her and tried to pretend his heart wasn't hammering against his ribs. Okay, we're rolling, Jace announced. Just talk about your favorite Cupmas, memories, team highlights, that sort of thing. Theo forced a smile and launched into safe territory. The party was incredible. Mira really outdid herself with the decorations, and seeing everyone come together for the holidays, that's what team bonding is all about. Grace nodded stiffly beside him, her professional mask firmly in place. The event exceeded our engagement projections. Fan response has been overwhelmingly positive. But what about the actual fun stuff, Mira prompted from behind the camera? Personal highlights, memorable moments? Theo felt Grace tense beside him, her breathing becoming shallow and quick. He should deflect, should talk about Victor's antics or the ugly sweater contest or literally anything other than the most memorable moment of his year. But when prompt came, what was your most memorable Cupmas moment? Theo found himself looking directly at Grace, forgetting about the camera and Jace and the consequences of honesty. Honestly, Cupmas was the most surprising night of the year. Grace's face went completely pale, her hands clenching around her tablet so hard the screen protector cracked slightly. But Theo couldn't stop himself from continuing, his voice softening despite the rolling camera. Sometimes the best moments are the ones you don't plan for, the ones that catch you completely off guard and make you realize that maybe what you thought you wanted isn't actually what you needed. He was looking right at her now, trying to communicate without words that he didn't regret anything, that waking up next to her had been the best morning of his year, even if she'd run away before he could tell her so, that he understood why she was scared, but he wasn't going anywhere. Grace's breath hitched audibly, and for a second her professional composure cracked completely. Her eyes met his, wide and vulnerable and full of the same longing that had been eating at him for days. And then she abruptly stood up, nearly knocking over her chair in her haste to escape. Technical difficulties, she mumbled, not looking at anyone. I need to check audio levels. The sound quality is feedback or something. She was out the door before anyone could respond, leaving Theo sitting alone in front of the camera with his heart in his throat and the devastating realization that he'd just confessed his feelings to thousands of potential viewers. Jace lowered his camera slowly, confusion written all over his face. Should I keep rolling or? Cut, Mira said, looking between the door Grace had fled through and Theo's miserable expression. We'll do pickup shots later. Theo sat in the sudden silence, staring at the empty chair beside him while the blinking reindeer on his sweater cast red light across his hands. He'd pushed too hard, said too much, let his feelings show on camera like a lovesick teenager instead of a professional athlete who should know better. Hey, Jay said quietly, is that footage usable for the reel? The question hit Theo like a slap. His vulnerable confession and Grace's obvious reaction were captured in high definition, ready to be edited and posted for fans who were already speculating about their mistletoe roulette kiss. The gossip forums would have a field day with his soft voice and her panicked exit. Grace would be mortified. Her internship could be in jeopardy if people started asking questions about her professionalism or her relationship with players. He'd been so focused on trying to tell her how he felt that he'd forgotten about the very real consequences of having feelings on camera. Actually, Theo said, standing up and walking over to Jace's setup, "Can I see the footage for continuity purposes?" Jace shrugged and handed over the camera, already distracted by Mira's request for B-roll shots of the empty interview setup. "Just hit playback. The files are all labeled." Theo found the segment easily enough. There was his face on the small screen, looking at someone off camera with an expression so tender and hopeless it made his stomach churn. He could hear his own voice saying those damning words, could see the exact moment Grace realized he was talking about her. Take one quick button sequence to delete the entire clip. "Hey," Jace said a few minutes later, reviewing his footage. "What happened to that interview segment? It's showing as corrupted." Theo shrugged, handing the camera back. "Must have been a technical glitch. These things happen." Jace frowned at his equipment, but Mira was already pulling him toward the door for exterior shots, and the moment passed without further investigation. Alone in the media room, Theo spotted Grace's emergency donut box sitting abandoned on the equipment table. The pastel pink cardboard was slightly dented from being hastily set down, and he could see the edge of one of her passive-aggressive sticky notes peeking out from under the lid. He picked it up carefully, running his thumb over the soft cardboard while wondering if she'd ever let him return it, or if avoiding him was her permanent plan now, in which case he'd be stuck with a box of stressed donuts and the memory of how she'd looked when she thought no one was watching her eat them. The sweater's lights continued their relentless blinking as Theo left the arena, the donut box tucked under his arm like evidence of a crime he couldn't quite bring himself to regret. That evening he sat in his apartment, still wearing the ridiculous Christmas sweater, staring at his phone while the donut box sat on his coffee table like an accusation. He had drafted 17 different texts to Grace, ranging from casual, "You left something at the arena," to desperate, "Can we please just talk?" to apology, "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable today." He deleted every single one without hitting send, because forcing her to respond when she was clearly not ready would make him just another guy who couldn't take no for an answer. And Grace deserved better than that, even if waiting for her to come around was slowly killing him. The reindeer's nose continued blinking in the dark, casting red light across the donut box and his unsent messages, a tiny heartbeat keeping time with his own stubborn hope.
Chapter 7, Sprinkles and Sabotage. The cupcake decorating station looked like a craft store had exploded. Bowls of frosting in team colors, black, silver, and venom green, sat arranged in perfect rows alongside containers of sprinkles, edible glitter, and tiny fondant hockey pucks that had cost more than Grace's monthly coffee budget. She clutched her clipboard with fan engagement protocol notes pressed against her chest like armor, her eyes scanning the setup for anything out of place. "Looks like you've got everything under control," Theo said from beside her, and Grace's grip tightened on the clipboard so hard the metal clip dug into her palm. "It's a simple activity," she said without looking at him, making another note about sprinkle distribution. "Children enjoy creative expression through structured guidance." Right. His voice carried that hint of amusement that made her stomach flutter in ways she absolutely could not afford. Structured guidance. Got it. Grace forced herself to focus on the task list instead of how the stupid Christmas sweater made his shoulders look unfairly broad, or how he'd rolled up the sleeves to reveal forearms that had no business being that distracting during a family-friendly event. The reindeer's blinking nose cast intermittent red light across his hands as he helped arrange piping bags, and she found herself memorizing the rhythm. The sound of excited chatter from the hallway made her snap back to attention. Mira's voice carried over the children's excited babble as she led the fan group toward their station. "And here's our Cupcake Creativity Corner, hosted by our amazing media intern Grace and player Theo Bianchi." The group of young fans rounded the corner in a burst of energy in Vipers jerseys, but their first words made Grace's blood freeze. "Are you guys the Mistletoe roulette couple?" A girl who couldn't be older than 12 asked, eyes bright with curiosity. "My mom showed me the video and said, you're like totally in love now." Grace's smile felt like it might crack her face. "Oh, well, that's..." We're here to focus on creative expression through cupcake artistry. Who's ready to make some masterpieces? But did you really kiss under the mistletoe? Another kid pressed, and Grace could feel heat climbing up her neck. My sister says all the best love stories start with mistletoe. Let's talk about frosting techniques instead, Grace said, her voice pitched slightly too high. We have 3 different consistencies here, and proper application requires. Are you going to get married? This from a boy wearing a backwards Viper's cap, grinning like he'd uncovered the scandal of the century. Grace's hand started shaking around her clipboard. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. Children she was supposed to be entertaining, asking questions she had no business answering, reducing her professional reputation to gossip about a night that was supposed to mean nothing. Okay, Theo said with a laugh, stepping forward to address the kids directly. How about we focus on making some amazing cupcakes instead? I heard there's a prize for the most creative design. It was a lie. There was no prize mentioned in Grace's extensive planning notes, but the children immediately perked up with competitive interest. Grace shot him a grateful look that lasted approximately half a second before she remembered she was supposed to be avoiding eye contact. Now, she said, picking up a piping bag filled with green frosting, proper technique requires steady pressure and controlled movement. Like this? She squeezed the bag to demonstrate, but her hands were still unsteady from the marriage questions and Theo's proximity. And instead of a neat rosette, a blob of green icing shot across the table and splattered directly onto a 10-year-old's pristine Viper's jersey. The silence that followed felt eternal. Oh no, Grace whispered, watching the icing slide slowly down the fabric. I'm so sorry. I can pay for cleaning or replacement or. No worries, Theo said smoothly, grabbing a napkin and approaching the icing splattered kid with a grin. That just means you've been officially initiated as a Viper's cupcake decorator. Congratulations. The boy beamed like he'd been blessed by hockey royalty instead of assaulted by frosting. And Theo continued, the trick is gentle pressure and steady hands. Like this. He demonstrated with his own piping bag, creating a perfect swirl with movements so controlled, Grace wondered if he'd been secretly practicing. See how I'm barely squeezing? Let the frosting do the work. Grace watched him move around the table, patiently showing each child the technique, his voice warm and encouraging as he praised wobbly attempts and offered gentle corrections. One particularly shy girl hadn't touched her cupcake yet, and Theo crouched down to her level. Hey, what's your favorite color? He asked quietly. Purple, she whispered. Purple is a great choice. Want me to show you how to mix colors to make your own purple frosting? The girl nodded eagerly, and Grace felt something tight in her chest as she watched Theo guide small hands in combining blue and red icing, his patience endless as they worked together to achieve the perfect shade. He was naturally good with kids in a way that shouldn't surprise her. She'd seen his social media posts with young fans, but seeing it in person made her heart do complicated things. Miss Grace, can you help me? Another child asked, holding up a piping bag with uncertainty. Grace approached carefully, still mortified by her earlier frosting disaster. Of course. Let's see what you're working on. She tried to guide the child through creating a border around their cupcake, but her hands were still unsteady, and the result was a lopsided mess that barely resembled intentional decoration. Here, Theo said quietly, appearing at her side. Mind if I help? Before she could object, his hands covered hers on the piping bag, his chest pressed against her back as he guided her movements. Just breathe, he murmured near her ear, his voice so low only she could hear. You've got this. The warmth of his hands on hers made her breath catch, and for a moment, she let herself lean back into his solid presence, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the way his body moved with hers to create smooth, even swirls of frosting. Everything else, the chattering children, the bright arena lights, her endless anxiety, faded to background noise. This was exactly the kind of moment she'd been trying to avoid, the kind that made her forget why keeping distance was important, why professional boundaries existed, why letting herself want things she couldn't have was a recipe for disaster. She pulled away abruptly, nearly bumping into a child reaching for sprinkles. Right, individual creativity. Everyone should focus on their own unique designs now. Theo's hands dropped to his sides, and she didn't look at his face. Couldn't handle seeing whatever expression he might be wearing. Looking good, everyone. she announced brightly, moving around the table to hover over shoulders and offer a generic encouragement while studiously avoiding Theo's section of the workspace. "This is amazing content," came JC's voice from somewhere to her left, and Grace's stomach clenched as she spotted him filming the controlled chaos. Most of his attention seemed focused on the children's excited faces and their increasingly elaborate cupcake designs, but she caught him turning the camera toward her and Theo more than once. When she met his eyes, his expression was thoughtful in a way that made her nervous. Jake's might come across as the team's chaotic social media menace, but Grace had seen enough of his work to know he had an eye for capturing unguarded moments, the kind of moments that told stories people weren't necessarily ready to share. "Hey, Jay," she said, forcing casualness into her voice. "Make sure to get some good shots of the kids' finished products. The fans love seeing creative results." "Oh, absolutely," he agreed, but his camera lingered on her face for another beat before moving away. The rest of the session passed in a blur of frosting, sprinkles, and excited chatter. The children created increasingly elaborate designs while Grace maintained professional distance and cheerful commentary, ignoring how aware she was of Theo's every movement and the way he kept trying to catch her eye. When Mira finally led the group away for their arena tour, Grace immediately began attacking the frosting splattered table with cleaning supplies, scrubbing at imaginary stains with manic energy. "It went well," Theo said behind her, his tone carefully neutral. "The kids had fun." "The engagement metrics should be strong," Grace replied without turning around, focusing intently on a particularly stubborn spot of silver icing. "Family-friendly content typically performs well across demographic segments." "Grace, we should probably document the cleanup process for behind-the-scenes content. Audiences appreciate authenticity in." "Grace." His voice was gentler this time, and she could hear him moving closer. "You don't have to analyze everything to death." She scrubbed harder at the table, her movements sharp and efficient. "Content strategy requires comprehensive planning. Every interaction is an opportunity to strengthen brand engagement." "Is that really what you think this was? Brand engagement?" The question made her hand still on the cleaning cloth, but she didn't turn around. What else would it be? The silence stretched long enough that she finally looked over her shoulder. Theo was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Nothing," he said finally. "You're right, just brain engagement." He left without another word, and Grace continued cleaning the already spotless table until her arms ached and there was nothing left to scrub. An hour later, Mira found her in the supply closet reorganizing containers of sprinkles by color gradient with the kind of obsessive precision that usually preceded a complete breakdown. "Hey," Mira said softly, settling down on the floor beside her among the scattered craft supplies. "You know, sometimes trying too hard to control how people see you just makes you invisible to yourself." Grace paused with a container of rainbow sprinkles in her hands, the words hitting somewhere unexpected and deep. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do." Mira picked up a jar of edible glitter, watching it catch the fluorescent light. "I've been planning events for 7 years. I know the difference between someone who cares about doing good work and someone who's terrified of being seen doing anything that isn't perfect." The sprinkles container felt suddenly heavy in Grace's hands. "I just want to do my job well." "Your job is to help people connect with the team, but how can you do that if you won't even connect with yourself?" Grace stared at the neat rows of supplies she'd arranged, thinking about binders full of protocols and contingency plans, about professional boundaries and reputation management, and all the careful walls she built to keep herself safe. When had protecting herself become the same thing as hiding from everything real? "The kids loved the segment," Mira continued, "not because of perfect frosting technique or strategic brand positioning. They loved it because they got to see people being genuine with each other." Grace set down the sprinkles and leaned back against the supply shelf, suddenly exhausted. "I don't know how to be genuine anymore without it feeling like a mistake." "Maybe making mistakes is part of being genuine." That evening, Grace sat cross-legged on her living room floor with her Cupmas planning binder spread out around her like the war plans it essentially was. Tabs labeled emotional risk assessment, professional image management, worst-case scenario protocols, and reputation damage control stared back at her in neat, color-coded rows. She'd spent 20 minutes staring at the sections, trying to work on posts, event analysis, and planning for the remaining holiday content, but the words blurred together. All she could think about was the weight of Theo's hands over hers, the patience in his voice as he helped the children, the way he'd stepped in to save her from frosting disaster without making her feel incompetent. With sudden decision, Grace grabbed a handful of tabs and tore them out of the binder. Emotional risk assessment went first, followed by professional image management and half a dozen other sections dedicated to controlling variables that couldn't actually be controlled. She threw them in the trash without reading them, then went back for more. When she finished, her comprehensive planning system had been reduced to essential logistics, schedules, contact information, actual job requirements, everything else, all the careful barriers and contingency plans and protocols for managing her feelings was gone. Staring at her stripped down binder, Grace felt simultaneously lighter and more vulnerable, like she'd discarded armor she hadn't realized was weighing her down. The remaining pages looked sparse and somehow more honest, but she wasn't sure what came next without all her careful defenses. Her phone buzzed with a text notification, and Grace's heart jumped before she could stop it. But it wasn't Theo, it was her mom asking about Christmas plans. Grace set the phone aside without answering and closed the binder, leaving it on the coffee table instead of filing it away in its usual spot. Tomorrow she'd figure out what came after letting go of control. Tonight, she just wanted to sit with the unfamiliar feeling of not knowing what came next and the strange relief of finally admitting she was tired of having a plan for everything except what she actually wanted.
Chapter 8. Victor Knows Too Much. The holiday fan event was in full swing, which meant chaos disguised as organized fun. Theo leaned against the wall near the merchandise table, watching Victor the Viper strike increasingly dramatic poses with a line of kids who seemed equally delighted and terrified by their 7-foot foam serpent hero. What he couldn't figure out was why Victor kept appearing whenever he and Grace ended up in the same general area. Yesterday, during cupcake decorating, Victor had somehow materialized behind them during the worst of Grace's frosting meltdown, hovering like a green guardian angel until Theo stepped in to help. This morning, during equipment setup, the mascot had wandered over to assist with backdrop adjustment, right as Grace was struggling with a particularly stubborn banner, giving Thea an excuse to offer his height advantage. Either Victor had developed an uncanny sense for romantic tension, or the person inside the costume was running some kind of elaborate matchmaking scheme. Given the Viper's track record with behind-the-scenes drama, both seemed equally possible. Theo was contemplating the probability of a sentient mascot when Victor suddenly appeared beside him with that unnerving, silent waddle that seemed to violate several laws of physics. The massive foam head turned toward him with those blank, perpetually staring eyes, and Theo resisted the urge to take a step back. "Hey, big guy, enjoying your day of..." Victor's oversized foam finger pointed dramatically toward the holiday photo booth on the far side of the arena, where a group of fans was just finishing up their session. The backdrop was covered in silver and red tinsel, with Viper's holiday wishes spelled out in glittering letters that probably violated multiple fire safety codes. "I'm good, thanks," Theo said, following Victor's pointing gesture. "Not really in the mood for photos right now." That turned out to be the wrong answer. Victor's foam finger shifted to point directly at Theo's chest, then back toward the photo booth, and before Theo could protest, the mascot was nudging him forward with surprising force for someone wearing what had to be 30 pounds of costume. "Victor, seriously, I don't..." Another nudge, harder this time, nearly sent him stumbling toward the booth. Okay, I get the message." He glanced back to see if anyone was witnessing his apparent kidnapping by Team Mascot, but Victor had already disappeared into the crowd with the kind of stealth that shouldn't have been possible for a 7-foot snake. The photo booth area was temporarily empty, the previous group having moved on to terrorize the hot chocolate station. Theo stood in front of the tinsel backdrop feeling ridiculous, wondering how to explain to the volunteer photographer that he'd been forcibly escorted here by their potentially unhinged mascot. He turned to find Grace approaching from the opposite direction, looking equally confused and slightly out of breath. Her hair was escaping from its usual bun, and she clutched her tablet against her chest like armor. "Did Victor just..." she started. "Physically manhandle you toward the photo booth?" "Yeah." Theo couldn't help grinning at her expression. "I'm starting to think there's a person in that costume who has opinions about our social lives." Grace glanced over her shoulder toward where Victor had vanished into the crowd. He cornered me by the equipment table. I was trying to check the camera battery levels for this afternoon's shoot, and he kept pointing that foam finger at me until I followed him over here. Maybe he wants us to test the photo setup, Theo suggested, though even he didn't believe it. Maybe he's malfunctioned, Grace muttered. But she was trying not to smile, and Theo felt something loosen in his chest at the first crack in her professional facade he'd seen in days. The camera's automatic timer chose that moment to activate, apparently triggered by motion sensors. A cheerful recorded voice announced, "Photo session starting in 10 seconds. Say Vipers." They both froze, staring at the camera like deer caught in headlights. We don't have to. Grace started. It's just a few photos, Theo said, moving to stand beside her in front of the backdrop, for testing purposes. The space between them felt carefully measured, like they were both hyper-aware of maintaining exactly the right amount of distance. Professional colleagues, nothing more. 5 seconds, the camera announced. Grace straightened her shoulders and fixed her smile into position, the same polished expression she wore for all official team content. Theo found himself doing the same thing, falling into the comfortable rhythm of media appearances where everything was friendly and surface level and safe. The first photo flashed, capturing them standing stiffly side by side like they were posing for a corporate headshot rather than a fun holiday booth. That was natural, Theo said dryly as the timer reset. Speak for yourself, I look completely relaxed. Grace's smile had already slipped back into professional territory, but there was laughter in her voice. The second photo caught them both trying too hard to look casual. Theo's grin too wide and Grace's pose too perfect. They were trying so hard to avoid looking at each other that the awkwardness was practically visible. Hey, that one was worse, Grace admitted. We're overthinking this, Theo said as the timer started again. It's just a photo booth, remember? Those things people use for fun? I remember the concept, Grace said, and this time her smile looked almost genuine. I'm just not sure I remember how to. She stepped slightly sideways as she spoke, her heel catching on the edge of the platform, just as Victor the Viper materialized behind them like some kind of holiday cryptid. The mascot's sudden appearance in the frame coincided perfectly with Grace losing her balance, her hand shooting out instinctively to steady herself. Her palm landed directly against Theo's, their fingers interlocking with surprising naturalness before either of them had time to think about it. Grace's eyes went wide, and Theo felt the same jolt of connection that had knocked him sideways at the cupcake station, the same feeling that everything else faded away except the warmth of her hand in his. They turned toward each other, without meaning to, Grace's startled expression softening into something vulnerable and real. Theo's careful smile fading into the kind of honesty that left him completely exposed. The camera flashed, capturing the moment when they forgot to pretend they didn't care about each other. They separated quickly, hands dropping to their sides as Grace took a deliberate step backward. Victor had already vanished again, leaving behind only the faint scent of fabric softener and the lingering question of whether foam costumes could smirk. That was, Grace started. Just the photo booth, Theo finished, though his hand still felt warm where hers had been. Probably should check the photo quality, right? Make sure the lighting's working properly for the fans. Grace nodded too quickly. Absolutely. Quality control. That's very important for fan experience optimization. They both stared at the camera's preview screen like it held the secrets of the universe. Instead of 4 photos of escalating emotional honesty, culminating in a moment neither of them wanted to name. They look fine, Grace said finally, her voice carefully neutral. Very professional. Totally professional, Theo agreed, though the final image on the screen showed them looking at each other like nothing else in the world existed, their joined hands clearly visible in the frame. 2 hours later, Theo was helping break down the merchandise table when his phone started buzzing with notifications. The first few were the usual social media noise he'd learned to ignore, but the frequency was picking up fast enough that other people started noticing. Dude, your phone is having a seizure, Jace commented, wrestling with a banner that seemed determined to strangle him. Did you accidentally go viral again? Theo pulled out his phone and opened Instagram to find the team's latest post, gaining traction at an unusual rate. The image showed a slightly blurred group shot from the photo booth, multiple players and fans clustered together for a chaotic group photo, with Victor's foam head visible in the background and everyone laughing at something off camera. But it wasn't the main subject people were focused on. In the background, partially hidden by tinsel and strategic blurriness, two silhouettes stood close together near the backdrop, close enough that it was impossible to tell if they were holding hands or just standing near each other, but intimate enough to spark immediate speculation. Jace had posted it with the caption, "Fan Day Shenanigans, Viper's Family." The comments were exploding. OMG, are those two holding hands in the background? Wait, is that Grace and Theo, the chemistry? Mistletoe really was real. I knew it. They're so cute together. Someone, please tell me this is happening. Ship, 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 ship. Theo scrolled through comment after comment of fans who had apparently been shipping him and Grace since the Cupmas party, analyzing every interaction and photo for signs of a secret romance. The enthusiasm was overwhelming and oddly touching, but also deeply uncomfortable, given Grace's obvious terror of exactly this scenario. He looked up to find Grace beside him, her face pale and her hand shaking slightly as she held up her own phone. The same post was open on her screen, comments appearing faster than either of them could read. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "People are going to think that we. She trailed off, apparently unable to finish the sentence, but the implication hung between them anyway. That we're together, that there's something real happening here, that the carefully professional distance we've been maintaining is exactly as fake as it feels. Theo forced himself to laugh, though it came out sounding more strained than casual. "Grace, it's just a blurry photo that could be anyone. You can barely see anything except shadows and tinsel. People see what they want to see." His smile felt tight and uncomfortable because he could see how genuinely terrified she was of their almost relationship being exposed to public scrutiny. The comments were full of fans rooting for them to be together, people who barely knew them but could apparently see the connection Grace kept running from. It stung more than he wanted to admit, the way she recoiled from the possibility that people might think she cared about him. But what if? Grace started. "What if nothing?" Theo interrupted gently. "It'll blow over by tomorrow. Trust me, the internet has the attention span of a goldfish when it comes to hockey gossip. Next week, they'll be shipping someone else." Grace nodded, but she still looked like she might throw up. She clutched her phone like it was evidence from a crime scene, and Theo had to resist the urge to take it away from her and delete the entire app. "You're right," she said finally. "It's just, I need to go check on the evening schedule, make sure everything's ready for tomorrow's content calendar." She disappeared before Theo could respond, leaving him standing there with his phone still buzzing with notifications from fans who were more excited about his love life than he was allowed to be. An hour later, he found Jace in the locker room editing video footage from the day with professional focus that seemed at odds with his usual chaotic energy. "Hey," Theo said, settling on the bench beside him. "Good turnout today." "Yeah, the fans loved it. Got some great content." Jace didn't look up from his tablet, but his fingers had paused on the scrub bar of whatever he was editing. "That photo booth thing was sweet. Good energy." Theo watched a preview screen, catching glimpses of various players and fans laughing, posing, generally having the kind of wholesome fun that made good PR material. "You know," he said carefully, "maybe going forward, we should keep the behind-the-scenes content more general. Focus on team activities instead of individual moments." That got Jace's attention. His eyes flicked up from the screen, studying Theo with the kind of sharp intelligence he usually hid behind jokes and memes. "Individual moments," Jace repeated slowly. "Just thinking about privacy. You know, some people prefer to keep their personal stuff separate from work stuff." I think he tried to keep his voice casual, like this was a general philosophical observation rather than a specific request to protect Grace from any more unwanted attention. Jace nodded slowly. "Yeah, I feel that. Boundaries are important." He went back to his editing, but Theo caught him deleting a few clips that looked like they might have been from the photo booth session. "Team activities are more inclusive anyway, better for engagement metrics." "Exactly," Theo said, though he wasn't entirely sure what engagement metrics were. "Thanks, man." "No problem." Jace glanced at him again. "For what it's worth, the comments on that post are really sweet. Fans just want people to be happy, you know?" Theo knew that was half the problem. That evening, Theo lay in bed, scrolling through the comments on Jace's post, reading message after message from fans who were genuinely excited about the possibility of him and Grace being together. People who had apparently been following their interactions since the beginning of the season, who noticed the way they looked at each other during interviews and the comfortable dynamic they developed during team content. They have such cute chemistry. I love how he always makes her laugh. Grace deserves someone who appreciates how hard she works. The way he looks at her in that Mistletoe video. Oh, gig. Please be real. Please be real. Please be real. The enthusiasm was overwhelming and strangely validating. People who barely knew them could see something worth rooting for, something real and worthwhile that Grace kept treating like a disaster to be managed. But reading through the comments also highlighted exactly what Grace was so afraid of. These people weren't just casually interested, they were invested. They'd created entire narratives around stolen glances and shared laughs, built a ship that could easily turn into disappointment or criticism if things went wrong. Grace wasn't just afraid of her professional reputation, she was afraid of letting down people who believed in something she didn't think she deserved. Theo set his phone aside without responding to any of the notifications, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about how many fans were rooting for something Grace was too scared to even consider wanting. The people who barely knew him could see what Grace kept running from, and tomorrow he'd have to pretend that didn't matter at all.
Chapter 9, What We Are. The overhead fluorescents in Keller Arena had been dimmed to their nighttime setting, casting everything in that weird institutional twilight that made even familiar spaces feel foreign. The usual harsh white light had mellowed into something amber and muted, throwing long shadows across polished floors and making the championship banners hanging from the rafters look like ghosts of glory. Grace's sneakers squeaked against the polished floors as she made her way through the main corridor, each step echoing with the hollow acoustics of empty space. A canvas bag full of replacement camera batteries slung over her shoulder felt heavier than it should have, like evidence of her complete inability to manage a normal work schedule, or maybe just proof that she'd volunteered for Sunday evening equipment maintenance specifically to avoid the Monday morning chaos when everyone would be back. She'd volunteered to handle the weekly equipment check on Sunday night specifically because it meant avoiding people, no morning meetings, no chance encounters in crowded hallways, no risk of running into certain players during the usual Monday media prep. Avoiding questions about why she deleted half her social media notifications without reading them, why she'd started taking the long way to the media room, why she flinched every time someone said Theo's name in casual conversation, avoiding Mira's knowing looks that suggested the events coordinator had developed some kind of supernatural ability to sense romantic tension from 3 hallways away, avoiding Jace's increasingly obvious attempts to capture candid moments between her and certain players whose names she wasn't letting herself think about. Players who made her pulse skip and her carefully organized world feel suddenly unstable. The arena felt cavernous and strange without the usual chaos of players, staff, and media buzzing through the corridors. No echo of skate blades against ice, no sound of equipment bags being dragged across floors, no overlapping conversations in 3 languages about power plays and penalty shots, just the steady hum of ice machines working overtime to maintain the rink temperature, the distant buzz of emergency lighting that never quite shut off, and the subtle creaking of a building settling into itself after another day of contained chaos. Every sound seemed amplified in the emptiness. The rustle of the battery bag against her hip, the whisper of her breath in the recycled air, the soft thud of her heartbeat that seemed unreasonably loud for someone who was supposedly just dropping off equipment and definitely not hoping to avoid a specific person. Grace pushed through the glass doors to the media equipment room, checking her phone for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. The screen lit up her face with blue light. 7:43 p.m. Most of the team would be long gone by now, either collapsed at home after the particularly brutal practice that had left everyone moving like they'd been hit by trucks, or out at dinner somewhere, with normal lighting and normal conversation that didn't revolve around power rankings and penalty minutes. Perfect timing for someone who had spent the past 3 days perfecting the art of strategic avoidance with the precision of a military operation. She'd become an expert at reading Theo's schedule, had memorized his patterns with the kind of detailed attention she usually reserved for content calendars and engagement metrics. She knew he usually left the arena by 7:15, that he preferred the side elevator near the player's entrance, that he always stopped by the equipment room to grab extra tape before heading out. Information she gathered purely for professional reasons, obviously. Definitely not because she'd memorized the way his voice sounded when he said her name, or because she kept replaying that moment in the photo booth when his fingers had accidentally brushed hers and her entire nervous system had short-circuited like a computer encountering corrupted data. The equipment room was mercifully empty and efficiently organized, exactly the way Grace liked spaces to be when she needed them to cooperate with her emotional management strategies. Cables coiled in perfect circles, cameras lined up by serial number, everything labeled with the kind of obsessive detail that made her feel like she had control over at least one small corner of the universe. She set the battery bag down on the main table with relief, started methodically checking each unit against her color-coded inventory list, letting the familiar rhythm of organizing and categorizing settle her pulse back to something approaching normal. The mechanical click of battery compartments opening and closing, the soft beep of charge indicators, the satisfying scratch of pen against paper as she made check marks, all of it combined into a meditative process that didn't require emotional navigation or interpretation of meaningful glances. This was good. This was manageable. Equipment maintenance didn't involve eye contact or accidental hand touching, or having to pretend she wasn't thinking about things she definitely shouldn't be thinking about. Batteries charged or they didn't. Cameras worked or they didn't. Simple binary choices that didn't require her to navigate whatever complicated emotional territory she'd wandered into without proper preparation or a backup plan. She'd finished with the battery inventory and was double-checking cable connections when she realized she hadn't grabbed the backup lighting kit from the locker room storage area. Grace stared at her checklist, at the empty box next to secondary equipment check, weighing the odds that she could get in and out of the players' area without encountering any lingering team members, against the professional embarrassment of having to make another trip tomorrow and explain to Mira why the equipment audit was incomplete. The checklist won. It always did. The locker room doors were heavier than usual, or maybe Grace was just more aware of everything tonight, hyper-tuned to sounds and textures, and the way familiar spaces looked different when stripped of their usual energy. The metal handles felt cold against her palms, and she could hear the faint echo of her own breathing in the corridor. She pushed through, expecting the same emptiness she'd found everywhere else, already mentally cataloging where the lighting equipment should be stored, and calculating how quickly she could retrieve it without looking like she was fleeing the scene of a crime. Instead, she froze. Theo was sitting alone on one of the benches, shirtless and slumped forward with an ice pack pressed against his left shoulder. His head was tilted back against the wall, eyes closed, face drawn, with the kind of pain that bypassed his usual easy humor and went straight to something raw and vulnerable. The locker room's fluorescent strips had been dimmed here too, casting him in soft shadows that made the purple bruising across his shoulder blade look even more dramatic against his olive skin. Grace's first instinct was to back out silently to retreat before he noticed her, and they both had to navigate whatever awkward small talk would be required to pretend this wasn't exactly the scenario she'd spent 3 days trying to avoid. Her hand was already moving toward the door handle when she caught sight of the careful way he was holding himself, the deliberate stillness that spoke of genuine injury rather than ordinary post-practice soreness. The bruising she could see spreading across his shoulder blade was the deep purple black of serious impact, the kind that made her stomach clench with sympathy. He looked hurt, actually hurt, not just tired or sore from the usual bumps and collisions that were part of hockey's daily routine, and despite every rational thought telling her to leave, to preserve the professional distance she'd been trying to maintain, to avoid the conversation they'd been dancing around for weeks, Grace found herself taking an involuntary step forward instead of back. Theo must have heard the movement because his eyes opened and found hers immediately. Grace braced herself for the awkward tension that had become their default dynamic. For him to make some joke about her tendency to appear and disappear like a particularly skittish ghost. For the familiar dance of banter and deflection that let them both pretend they weren't walking around something important. Instead, he just looked at her with an expression that was tired and relieved and genuinely glad, like seeing her was the first good thing that had happened to him all day. There was no performance in it, no attempt to mask pain with humor or charm his way past the awkwardness they'd been carrying between them. Hey, he said, voice rough but warm, scratchy in a way that suggested he'd been sitting here longer than was probably smart. The simple greeting hit Grace harder than any flirtation or teasing could have. There was no pretense in it, no calculation. Just Theo, hurt and alone in an empty locker room, saying hello like she belonged there, like her presence was something he'd been hoping for rather than something to manage or deflect. Hey, she managed back, setting down the battery bag near the door with hands that weren't quite steady. Are you okay? Theo shifted the ice pack slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at whatever injury he was nursing. The sound he made was small and involuntary, the kind of pain response that bypassed conscious control. Occupational hazards of playing enforcer, he said, attempting his usual lightness but not quite managing to hide the strain underneath. Murphy caught me with a check right into the boards during the scrimmage this afternoon. Nothing's broken, just feels like someone took a sledgehammer to my shoulder and decided to test their swing. Grace found herself moving closer, drawn by concern that overrode her usual calculation of appropriate professional distance. Each step brought her deeper into the locker room's intimate atmosphere, past the point where she could pretend this was just a coincidental encounter. That looks really painful, she said, and her voice came out softer than she'd intended, colored with genuine worry that she couldn't quite disguise as professional courtesy. Yeah, well, Theo managed a shadow of his usual grin, but even that seemed to cost him effort. Part of the glamorous hockey lifestyle they don't show in the highlight reels. All the endorsement deals and magazine covers, none of the sitting alone in empty locker rooms with frozen vegetables pressed against your spine. She was close enough now to see the full extent of the bruising. Purple-black blooms spreading from his shoulder across his back in a pattern that made her stomach clench with sympathy. The ice pack he was holding looked inadequate against the angry swelling, and she could see the way he was favoring his left side. The careful control he was exerting to keep from moving in ways that would aggravate the injury, without running through the professional implications or calculating the appropriate response. Grace sat down on the bench beside him, close enough that she could smell the familiar combination of ice melt and whatever soap he used. Something clean and understated that somehow managed to cut through the locker room's usual cocktail of disinfectant and equipment leather. The silence stretched between them, but it felt different than the charged tension they'd been carrying around for days. Softer somehow, less like they were both waiting for the other person to make a mistake or say the wrong thing. The air itself seemed different, warmer despite the ice machines humming in the background, more intimate in the way that physical pain could strip away pretense and leave people more honest than they meant to be. Grace stared at her hands, at the way her fingers were twisted together in her lap, and tried to find words for something she'd never been particularly good at expressing, an apology that went deeper than professional courtesy, an explanation for behavior that didn't make complete sense even to her. I'm sorry I keep running away, she said finally, voice barely above a whisper, the words carried more by breath than sound. Theo turned to look at her, and the gentleness in his expression made her chest ache with something she didn't have a proper category for. Not quite guilt, not exactly longing, but some complicated combination that made her feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with work protocols or reputation management. I don't understand why you're scared of me, he said quietly, voice rough with fatigue and something deeper. I mean, I get that the work situation is complicated, but Grace, it's like you think I'm going to hurt you somehow, and I don't know what I did to make you feel that way. I keep replaying every conversation we've had, trying to figure out where I went wrong. Grace felt her carefully constructed defenses start to crumble, all the rational reasons she'd compiled for keeping distance suddenly seeming thin and inadequate against the genuine confusion in his voice. It's not you, she said, voice catching slightly on words that felt too small for what she was trying to explain. It's me. It's my whole life being about proving I belong somewhere, about earning the right to take up space. I can't afford to mess up my career for whatever this is between us. She gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the invisible current that had been pulling at her since the first time they'd shared an elevator, and she caught herself staring at his hands, at the way he moved through space with confident ease that she envied and admired in equal measure. Grace? Theo's voice was soft, careful, like he was approaching a startled animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. What if I told you this isn't just some random hookup for me either? That I think about you when you're not here? That I've been trying to figure out how to ask you for coffee without making it weird. Something fundamental shifted in Grace's chest, like a wall she'd spent years building, suddenly had a hairline crack running through it. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made all her professional calculations seem suddenly irrelevant. She looked at Theo's earnest face, at the way he was holding himself carefully still, like he was afraid she'd bolt again if he moved too quickly or said too much. Instead of running, Grace leaned forward and kissed him softly. The kiss was tentative at first, tasting of uncertainty and hope and the lingering sweetness of whatever sports drink he'd been nursing. His lips were chapped from the arena's dry air, warm against hers in a way that made her realize how cold she'd been without knowing it. But when Theo's good arm came up to cup her face, thumb brushing over her cheekbone with devastating gentleness, Grace felt herself melting into the contact like she'd been holding her breath for weeks and finally remembered how to exhale. "I'm terrified," she whispered against his mouth, the words barely sound, more vibration than voice. "Me too," Theo whispered back, pulling her closer with his uninjured arm, and the admission seemed to break something open between them. Grace shifted closer on the narrow bench, her legs finding space on either side of Theo's hips as they kissed with months of denied tension spilling over in breathy gasps and gentle touches that felt both urgent and reverent. The metal bench was cold against her knees through her jeans, but Theo's skin was warm where her fingers found the planes of his chest, where she could feel his pulse racing under her palm in rhythm that matched her own accelerated heartbeat. Theo's injured shoulder limited his range of motion, but Grace didn't mind the careful way he had to move, the deliberate softness of his touch as his fingers found the hem of her viper's polo and slipped underneath to trace patterns on her skin. Each touch sent electricity up her spine, made her breath catch in ways that had nothing to do with the arena's recycled air. She could feel goosebumps rising where his fingers traced along her ribs, could hear the way his breathing changed when she kissed a sensitive spot just below his ear, where his pulse fluttered against her lips. Everything about this was the opposite of what Grace had trained herself to expect from physical intimacy. Instead of feeling exposed or vulnerable in ways that require immediate damage control, she felt safe enough to let her guard down, to admit through touch what she couldn't quite say with words. The locker room around them seemed to fade until there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the rustle of fabric, the soft sounds they made against each other's mouths. When they finally broke apart, Grace found herself lying against Theo's good side, her head pillowed on his chest where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heartbeat gradually slowing back to normal. His skin was warm and slightly damp with perspiration, and she could smell the familiar scent of him underneath the clinical odor of ice-packed plastic. He traced idle patterns on her bare shoulder with fingers that shook slightly, whether from residual adrenaline or the cold air, she couldn't tell. The locker room was still dim and quiet around them, but it no longer felt empty or institutional. It felt like a private world where they could exist without outside expectations or professional obligations, where Grace could be someone who didn't calculate every interaction or color code her emotional response. Grace noticed her abandoned battery bag sitting near the door where she dropped it and realized she stopped calculating the professional risks of being here, stopped running through worst-case scenarios and reputation management strategies. For the first time in recent memory, she was just present in a moment, without trying to control what came next, without planning her exit strategy or considering how this will look in tomorrow's light. "What happens now?" Theo asked quietly, voice rumbling under her ear like distant thunder. Grace didn't have a neat answer or a color-coded plan. She didn't know how they'd navigate the team dynamic or what Mira would say when she inevitably figured out what was happening. She couldn't predict whether this would turn into the kind of messy workplace drama that ended careers and friendships, or whether they'd find a way to make it work without destroying everything they'd both worked for. But she also didn't run. Instead, she pressed a soft kiss to Theo's collarbone, tasting salt and warmth and the faint metallic tang of the ice pack that had been pressed against his skin. "I want to figure it out together," she admitted, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "Even if it terrifies me. Even if I don't know what." Theo's arm tightened around her, and Grace could feel him smile against the top of her head, his lips warm against her hair. "I can work with terrified," he said, voice soft with something that might have been relief. "Terrified is better than nothing." Terrified means you care enough to be scared. Grace closed her eyes and let herself stay exactly where she was, learning the rhythm of Theo's breathing and the weight of his hand on her back, the way his chest rose and fell beneath her cheek. Tomorrow would bring complications and conversations and probably a dozen new items for her anxiety checklist. There would be questions about protocol and boundaries, about what this meant for her internship and their professional relationship. But right now, in the quiet sanctuary of an empty locker room, Grace finally stopped running.
Chapter 10, Victor's Mic Never Forgets. Theo was elbow deep in the production equipment bin, muttering under his breath about whoever had decided spare camera batteries belonged buried under a tangle of extension cords and lens cloths that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old coffee. His fingers closed around something that definitely wasn't a battery, something round and sparkly that made his brain immediately flash to glitter cannons and holiday chaos. The texture was all wrong, too smooth and metallic against his callous fingertips. He pulled out Victor's holiday microphone with a confused frown, turning the gaudy thing over in his hands like it was some kind of alien artifact. The mic was covered in silver glitter that immediately transferred to his fingers in a fine, persistent dust, and someone had stuck tiny reindeer stickers around the base with the kind of precision that screamed Mira's handiwork. It looked like Christmas had thrown up on a piece of professional audio equipment, then rolled around in craft store clearance. What the hell was this doing mixed in with the regular gear? Theo was about to toss it back into the bin when he noticed the small recording light blinking red near the power button, a steady pulse that made his stomach drop like he'd missed the last step on a staircase. The mic was still storing audio files, which meant someone had been using it recently and hadn't cleared the memory. Standard protocol was to wipe equipment after every use, but holiday chaos had a way of making people forget the basics. Grace had been using this mic during the Cupmas announcements. She must have grabbed it with the rest of the equipment when we left the party. He remembered her going back for her work bag. She was probably going to want whatever was on here deleted. Likely just her muttering about content schedules or reminding herself to order more backup batteries. The kind of mundane work audio that would mortify her if anyone overheard her obsessing over metrics or talking herself through equipment logistics. He could picture her now, flustered and apologetic, explaining that she'd meant to delete everything but got distracted by some social media emergency. Theo grabbed his earbuds from his jacket pocket, the wire catching slightly on the zipper as he pulled them free. He plugged them into the mic's output jack, the connection clicking into place with mechanical certainty. He'd just quickly delete whatever Grace had accidentally left behind and save them both the embarrassment. Easy cleanup, no harm done, the kind of small kindness that teammates did for each other without making it a big deal. He hit play and immediately heard Grace's voice, soft and vulnerable in a way that made his chest tighten with recognition and something darker, dread maybe, or the awful knowledge that he was about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. Theo's finger froze over the delete button, his entire nervous system suddenly hyper-aware of the weight of the earbuds, the scratch of the plastic against his ears, the way Grace's voice carried exhaustion like a physical thing. This wasn't work audio. Grace sounded like she was somewhere quiet and private, her voice carrying that shaky quality it got when she was trying not to cry, the same tremor he'd heard in the locker room when she thought no one was listening. The background noise suggested she was indoors, maybe sitting somewhere with fabric nearby, a couch or a bed. The soft sounds of someone shifting against cushions. His apartment, this was from his apartment, probably recorded the morning after Cupmas, when she'd fled without saying goodbye, leaving nothing behind but the faint scent of her shampoo on his pillowcase and a coffee mug abandoned on his kitchen counter. I've never been good at letting people want me without waiting for them to change their mind and leave. Theo's heart cracked down the middle, the sound of it loud enough in his own ears that he worried Grace might somehow hear it through the recording. Her voice was so small, so unsure, nothing like the confident intern who color-coded everything and talked in hashtags and metrics like they were magic spells that could organize the chaos of human emotion into manageable spreadsheet cells. This was Grace stripped of all her professional armor, admitting fears that made everything about her sudden distance make terrible sense, like puzzle pieces clicking into place to form a picture he'd rather not see. Every guy I've ever been with got bored once the chase was over, and I can't do that with him, not when he looks at me like I matter. The recording quality was surprisingly clear, Probably because she'd been holding the mic close without realizing it was on, her breath creating tiny distortions in the audio that made Theo feel like he was sitting right next to her. He could hear the exact moment her voice started to break, could picture her sitting on the edge of his bed, clutching the sparkly microphone like a lifeline, while her world tilted sideways, maybe still wearing one of his hoodies that hung too big on her frame. I don't know how to be wanted without worrying it'll all get taken away the second I'm not perfect anymore. Grace took a shuddering breath that Theo felt in his own chest, a sympathetic echo that made his ribs ache. He had to pause the recording because his hands were shaking and he couldn't see the controls clearly through the sudden blur in his eyes, salt water making everything look refracted and strange. She thought he was going to get bored, thought he was just entertaining himself until something more interesting came along, like she was a puzzle he'd solve and then discard. No wonder she'd been running from him, building walls out of spreadsheets and professional boundaries, treating their connection like a security breach that needed immediate containment. She wasn't protecting her reputation, she was protecting her heart from what she saw as inevitable abandonment. Theo unplugged his earbuds with movements that felt disconnected from his body, muscle memory operating while his brain tried to process what he'd just heard. He stared at the sparkly microphone, its glitter catching the harsh fluorescent lights like tiny accusations, feeling like he was holding Grace's heart in his hands, fragile and precious, and absolutely not meant for him to see. Every interaction they'd had since Cupmas suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. Her insistence that it meant nothing, delivered with the kind of forced brightness that should have been a dead giveaway. Her panic whenever they got too close, the way she'd physically step back like proximity was dangerous, the way she'd kissed him in the locker room like she was drowning and he was air, then immediately started building escape routes with the efficiency of someone who'd had plenty of practice. She wasn't emotionally unavailable, she was terrified. The recording probably continued, but Theo couldn't bring himself to listen to more. He'd already heard too much. Grace's deepest fears laid bare in a moment when she thought she was completely alone. The kind of raw honesty that people only admitted to themselves in the dark. The kind that would destroy her if it ever became public. Would turn her carefully managed professional image into tabloid fodder and social media speculation. He should delete it right now, immediately, pretend he'd never heard Grace's voice crack as she admitted she didn't know how to be wanted without conditions attached. It was the right thing to do, the kind thing to do, the choice that would preserve her privacy and his own conscience. Instead, Theo pocketed the mic, its weight settling against his ribs like a secret he wasn't ready to carry. He told himself he needed time to think, needed to figure out whether to tell Grace about the recording or just quietly erase it and pretend her vulnerability had never accidentally made it onto digital storage, never existed outside the private space of his apartment where she'd felt safe enough to fall apart. But the truth was messier. He couldn't bring himself to delete Grace's words, even knowing they weren't meant for him, even knowing that keeping them made him complicit in something that felt too close to voyeurism. They explained everything about why loving her felt like trying to hold water, why every step forward was followed by 3 steps back, why she looked at him sometimes like she was memorizing his face for when he inevitably left. Maybe hearing her say it out loud would help him figure out how to love someone who was convinced love was temporary, a limited time offer that expired the moment you stopped being worth the effort. The next morning arrived with Theo still carrying the weight of Grace's confession in his jacket pocket, the mic's hard edges pressing against his ribs every time he moved. He'd barely slept, kept pulling out the device and staring at its blinking light like it might offer answers he couldn't find on his own, like Grace's voice might somehow leak out and tell him what to do with the knowledge he'd accidentally stolen. He was nursing his second cup of coffee in the arena's break room when Jace appeared in the doorway, hair still messy from sleep and looking frazzled in the way that meant Mira had dumped a last-minute project on him. There were stress lines around his eyes and a coffee stain on his Viper's hoodie that suggested he'd been rushing since the moment his alarm went off. "Dude, please tell me you know where that festive mic is," Jay said, already rifling through the equipment shelves with a kind of focused desperation that came from tight deadlines and perfectionist event managers. "I need it for the fan Q&A segment this morning, and Mira said something about maintaining holiday brand continuity, even though Christmas was literally 2 weeks ago." Theo's stomach lurched, coffee turning bitter in his mouth. The mic. With Grace's vulnerable confession still stored in its memory, sitting in digital limbo like a time bomb waiting for one careless button press to explode her carefully constructed professional walls. Ace found it. Jace spun around triumphantly, holding up a different microphone covered in red and green tinsel that looked like it had been attacked by an overzealous craft store display. Wait, no, this isn't the sparkly one. Grace specifically used the silver glittery one for announcements. Fans are expecting consistency, he added, mimicking Mirror's earnest tone with the kind of affectionate mockery that meant he actually respected her attention to detail. Theo's hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket, fingers closing around the shape of Victor's mic through the fabric. The metal was warm from his body heat, and somehow that made everything worse, like he'd been carrying around Grace's secrets long enough to absorb them into his own skin. He should speak up, should tell Jace he had it, should warn him about checking the existing files first, should do literally anything except sit there watching his teammates search for the device that contained Grace's heart. Time crunch, man, Jace continued, grabbing random equipment and shoving it into his camera bag with a kind of organized chaos that suggested he was better at this job than he pretended. Mirror have scheduled this thing back to back with media interviews, and you know how she gets when the content calendar falls behind. Theo opened his mouth to say something, anything, but Jace was already bolting toward the door, sneakers squeaking against the linoleum in his rush to make it to the media room before Mirror realized he was running late. If you see the sparkly mic anywhere, bring it to the media room, Jace called over his shoulder. I'll make do with backup equipment, but Grace is going to be pissed if we don't maintain aesthetic consistency for the social posts. The break room door swung shut behind Jace, leaving Theo alone with his coffee and the weight of Grace's accidentally recorded confession. He pulled out the mic, its glitter catching the fluorescent lights like tiny accusations, each sparkle a reminder that he was holding something that could ruin everything Grace had worked for. 5 minutes. That's how long he had before Jace realized the backup mic sounded different and started hunting for the sparkly one with the kind of determined efficiency that made him good at content creation. 5 minutes to decide whether to hand over Grace's vulnerability or keep it buried in his pocket like stolen treasure. His phone was already in his hand. Grace's contact pulled up before he had consciously decided to call her. His thumb hovered over her name, cursor blinking with the same rhythm as the mic's recording light, both of them marking time until he made a choice that would change everything. He could roar her, could tell her to find Jace and insist on using different equipment, could fabricate some technical excuse about audio quality or brand consistency that would sound plausible coming from someone who'd spent years around broadcast equipment, could protect her without admitting he'd heard her deepest fears spelled out in shaky whispers, could save her reputation without sacrificing his own moral high ground. But that would mean lying to her again. More secrets, more walls, more reasons for Grace to believe that vulnerability only led to betrayal and that trusting people was just another way to get hurt. Theo pocketed his phone and walked toward the media room, the sparkly mic burning against his palm like evidence of every way love could be weaponized. Through the doorway, he could see Jace setting up his camera equipment, testing sound levels on the backup mic with increasing frustration, the kind of perfectionist anxiety that meant the audio wasn't meeting his standards. Grace wasn't here yet. She was probably in the main office coding her morning schedule and preparing talking points for the Q&A session she didn't know was about to expose her heart to the world, assuming that professional preparation could protect her from the chaos of human emotion. Theo leaned against the doorframe watching Jace fiddle with audio settings and mutter about subpar equipment standards while adjusting camera angles with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make magic happen with whatever tools were available. Every instinct screamed at him to walk in there and hand over the mic, to trust that Jace would be professional enough to check existing files before hitting record. But Jace was young and rushed and prone to assuming equipment came pre-cleaned, the kind of optimistic faith in systems that came from never having been burned by other people's carelessness. And Grace's confession was sitting in digital storage like a loaded weapon, waiting for one careless button press to detonate everything she'd built. Theo's finger found his phone screen again, Grace's contact information glowing like a lifeline he was too afraid to grab. Call her. Don't call her. Protect her privacy. Protect her heart. Let her make her own choices about what risks were worth taking. Stand outside the media room like a statue and hope that love was enough to make the right choice obvious. The cursor kept blinking. Jace kept swearing at his backup equipment with creative combinations of technical jargon and playground insults. Grace's voice kept echoing in Theo's memory, soft and broken as she admitted she didn't know how to be wanted, without fearing abandonment, without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Time was running out, and Theo still didn't know whether saving Grace meant calling her or letting her fall.
Chapter 11, Mistletoe Fallout. Grace had exactly 14 minutes left of her lunch break when Jace's latest behind-the-bench reel autoplayed on her phone, and her blood turned to ice. The video opened with typical Jace chaos, shaky camera work, teammates throwing equipment in the background, someone's protein shake spilling across a bench. Standard locker room content that usually made Grace smile despite herself, but then the camera swung left, capturing Theo in profile as he taped his stick, and Grace's sandwich turned to cardboard in her mouth. Theo was looking directly off camera with an expression she'd never seen before, desperate, raw, like someone drowning in plain sight. His face held the kind of longing that belonged in private moments, in whispered confessions against her collarbone, in the spaces between heartbeats when he thought she wasn't watching. The audio quality was crisp, too crisp, as Theo's voice cut through the locker room noise, clearly responding to something Jace had asked off camera about his recent mood. If she mattered less, I'd stop feeling like this. Grace's hands shook so violently, she nearly dropped her phone. The words hung in the air like shattered glass, intimate and unguarded in a way that made her chest seize. This wasn't the mic recording from his apartment. This was fresh footage from practice. Theo caught off guard by one of Jace's casual questions about his obvious distraction. This was the voice Theo used at 3 a.m. when he thought she was asleep, the voice he'd used when he'd traced patterns on her shoulder and admitted he was falling harder than he planned. The view count was climbing. 12.3K, 12.4K. The comment section exploded in real time, notifications pinging against Grace's screen like bullets. Who is she? Feels in love. OMG, this is everything. This is about the intern, isn't it? I knew it. That voice, though? Sir, you are down bad. Wait, rewind. Did anyone else notice how he looked at that girl during the cupcake thing? By calling it now. Theo and the intern Grace. Check the holiday content. They're obvious. Grace's vision blurred as fans dissected their every interaction with the surgical precision of professional detectives. Someone had screenshotted moments from the Cupmas content where Theo's hand had lingered near hers. Another user had created a compilation of significant glances from various team videos. A third had analyzed the seating arrangements during media shoots and declared them suspiciously consistent. Every moment she thought they'd kept private was being excavated and examined under digital microscopes by thousands of strangers who treated her vulnerability like entertainment. The worst part wasn't the exposure. The worst part was the sick realization crawling up her throat. Theo must have known this would be posted. He used her confession against her, turned their secret into content for his public image, while she'd been protecting him at the cost of her own sanity. Grace's professional composure, carefully maintained for months of navigating workplace politics and intern hierarchies, finally cracked under the weight of feeling like a fool. She shoved her untouched lunch into the break room trash and grabbed her keys. The drive to Theo's apartment building passed in a haze of fury and heartbreak warring in her chest. Grace had broken at least 4 traffic laws and definitely run a yellow light, but the only thing louder than her racing pulse was the echo of Theo's voice saying her feelings mattered enough to destroy him. Public content, thousands of views, comments speculating about her name, her job, her body, her worthiness of being loved by someone like him. Grace slammed her car door hard enough to rattle the windows and took the stairs to Theo's floor 2 at a time, her heels clicking against concrete like weapons. When Theo opened his door, he looked genuinely confused. Tousled hair, concerned eyes, wearing the ridiculous Viper's hoodie she'd once stolen and worn to bed. The sight of him, rumpled and real and apparently oblivious, made her fury spike higher. Grace, what are you? She shoved her phone at him, the video still playing on loop. How could you do this to me? Was any of it real, or was I just content for your comeback story? Theo's face went pale as he watched the clip, his eyes tracking the view count with growing horror. Grace, I had nothing to do with this being posted. I swear to God, I didn't know. Don't. Grace's voice cracked like ice breaking. Don't lie to me. Not now. You use my feelings to make yourself look sympathetic and relatable to fans. The tortured romantic, pining for some mystery girl who's just accessible enough to keep your image interesting. That's not. Grace, listen to me. Thousands of people are watching you talk about how much I matter, Grace continued, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to get them out before she lost her nerve entirely. Thousands of people are commenting about how obvious we've been, dissecting every time you've looked at me like I'm some kind of interactive content for them to decode. Theo stepped closer, his hands reaching for her. I would never. You knew this would happen. Grace backed against the hallway wall, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide from the hurt pouring out of her chest. You had to know Jace posts everything. You had to know fans would figure it out. And you said it anyway because you wanted them to see you as the guy who feels things, who's vulnerable and real and worthy of. Grace, stop. Theo's voice was urgent, almost pleading. You're wrong. I had nothing to do with this. I would never expose you like that. Never. Then explain it. Grace's composure finally shattered completely, leaving her voice raw and broken. Explain how your most private thoughts ended up as public content. Explain how I've been protecting your reputation while mine gets shredded by strangers who think they know what we are. I can't. Theo ran his hands through his hair, frustration and panic bleeding into his voice. I don't know how it happened, but I swear on everything I care about, I didn't know that would be posted. I would have deleted it. I would have protected you. Grace laughed, but it sounded more like sobbing. Protected me, like you protected me from being speculated about online? Like you protected me from having my job threatened by association with you? Like you protected me from feeling like an idiot for thinking someone like you could actually. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't admit how deeply she'd fallen while trying to convince herself it was just physical, just temporary, just safe enough to survive. Grace, Theo's voice broke on her name. Look at me, please. When she finally met his eyes, they were wet with tears she'd never seen him shed. I knew I was falling for you, he said quietly. I knew it was getting real, and I was scared because you kept saying it didn't mean anything. Kept acting like you were ready to run the second things got complicated. Because things like this happen. Grace gestured at her phone where notifications were still pinging with new comments. Because I knew caring about you would cost me everything. And I knew you'd break my heart the second you decided I wasn't worth the risk, Theo shot back. But I stayed. I kept showing up. I kept hoping you'd stop being so goddamn scared of wanting something real. They were standing too close now, close enough that Grace could see the flecks of gold in Theo's dark eyes, could smell the familiar scent of his laundry detergent and whatever expensive cologne he wore to media events. I trusted you, Grace whispered, and the words felt like confession and accusation rolled into one. Then trust me now, Theo said, reaching up to touch her face with shaking fingers. Trust that I would never hurt you on purpose. Trust that this matters to me too much to turn it into a joke for strangers. Grace wanted to pull away, wanted to leave before she made this worse, before she gave him more ammunition to use against her later. But when Theo's thumb brushed against her cheek, catching tears she hadn't realized were falling, her resolve crumbled. She kissed him like she was drowning, like he was air and water and everything she needed to survive. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer as he kissed her back with desperate intensity. It was angry and tender and completely wrong given that her phone was still buzzing with notifications about their supposedly private relationship. But Grace couldn't stop, couldn't pull away from the one person who'd made her feel wanted without conditions, even if trusting him had blown up in her face. They stumbled into his apartment without breaking apart, Grace's hands already working at the buttons of Theo's shirt while he backed her toward his bedroom. This felt different from before, edged with desperation and the knowledge that everything was falling apart around them. They fell into bed with passion that tasted like tears and anger and need all tangled together. Grace clung to Theo like she was trying to memorize how it felt to be wanted before it all disappeared, while he kissed her like he was trying to prove something neither of them could articulate. When it was over, they lay in the wreckage of their clothes and emotions, Grace's head on Theo's chest as his fingers traced patterns on her shoulder. The familiarity of it made her heart ache. The silence stretched until Grace couldn't stand it anymore. "Is this just pretend for you too?" she asked, quietly staring at the ceiling. "Because everyone online thinks you're in love with some mystery girl, and I need to know if I'm just the convenient body filling that role." Via's hand stilled against her skin. "Grace?" Because if this is just about having someone to sleep with while maintaining your image as the romantic hero, Grace sat up, reaching for her discarded sweater. "If I'm just a placeholder until someone better comes along?" "You're not a placeholder." Theo tried to pull her back down, but Grace was already moving away from him. "My feelings for you are real. Everything between us is real." Grace pulled her sweater over her head, not meeting his eyes. "Real enough to survive being public knowledge? Real enough for you to defend me when fans decide I'm not good enough for you? Real enough for you to choose me over your career if it comes to that?" "It won't come to that." "It already has." Grace stood up, looking for her shoes. "Your confession is trending. People are analyzing our body language in team videos. Someone's probably already figured out where I live." She found her phone on the nightstand, the screen still lit up with notifications. The view count had doubled while they'd been in bed together. "Are you going to post about this too?" Grace asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "About how the mystery girl came over to fight with you? About how our breakup will be tomorrow's content?" "Grace, stop. Don't do this." But Grace was already moving toward the door, her professional walls sliding back into place like armor. She'd been a fool to think someone like Theo could want someone like her for real, had been a fool to believe that careful planning and color-coded schedules could protect her from the chaos of actually caring about someone. "This was a mistake," she said, without turning around. "All of it." Grace left Theo's apartment feeling hollowed out and ashamed, convinced she'd been an idiot for believing love could be anything other than a performance designed to hurt her. She drove home, planning to submit her transfer paperwork first thing Monday morning. Staying at the Vipers would be professional suicide now that thousands of fans were speculating about her relationship with their star player. But the worst part wasn't losing her job. The worst part was losing the illusion that she could matter to someone without it destroying everything she'd worked for. Grace's phone buzzed with one final notification as she pulled into her driveway. Theo's name on her screen. A text she deleted without reading. Some mistakes were too expensive to repeat.
Chapter 12, Binder Tab, Regret. Theo arrived at Keller Arena 45 minutes before anyone else, armed with coffee and a speech he'd been rehearsing since 3 a.m. He had a plan. Catch Grace before the chaos started, explain about the video leak, and convince her that his feelings were real. The plan fell apart the second he spotted her across the main corridor. Grace moved through the building like she had some kind of internal radar system calibrated specifically to avoid him. When he headed toward the media office, she slipped into a supply closet. When he circled back through the player tunnel, she'd already vanished around the opposite corner, leaving only the faint scent of her vanilla perfume and the echo of quick footsteps on concrete. It would have been impressive if it weren't so devastating. Theo spent 20 minutes playing an involuntary game of hide-and-seek with someone who clearly had no intention of being found. He caught glimpses of a flash of her Viper's hoodie disappearing through emergency exits, her familiar ponytail swinging around corners just out of reach. But Grace had evidently memorized every alternate route in Keller Arena and was using that knowledge to avoid him with military precision. By the time practice started, Theo felt like he was losing his mind. He laced up his skates with more force than necessary, frustrated beyond belief that someone barely 5'4" could outmaneuver him in a building he'd been skating through for 3 years. How was Grace managing to stay completely invisible while still doing her job? The answer became clear once he hit the ice. Through the glass, Theo could see Grace moving efficiently around the arena's upper level, checking camera angles and managing equipment setups with her usual methodical precision. But she kept her back turned to the rink at all times, like she was deliberately avoiding any chance of accidental eye contact. Even when the rest of the media team gathered at the boards to film practice drills, Grace stayed conspicuously busy with tasks that required her to face away from the ice. She reorganized supply carts that didn't need reorganizing. She tested camera batteries that were already fully charged. She cleaned lenses that were already spotless. Watching her work so hard to pretend he didn't exist made Theo's chest ache in ways he couldn't shake off. even when Coach called his name twice during a passing drill. 3 days ago, Grace had been falling apart in his arms, telling him she didn't know how to be wanted without worrying it would be taken away. Now she was treating him like he was radioactive, maintaining such careful distance that she might as well have been on a different planet. The worst part was understanding exactly why she was doing it. Grace thought he'd leaked that video on purpose, thought their whole relationship had been some kind of performance for his benefit, with her as the unwitting co-star. She'd left his apartment believing she was just another convenient body filling a role in his public image. And Theo couldn't figure out how to convince her otherwise when she wouldn't let him get within 50 feet of her. After practice, Theo tried one more time to intercept Grace near the equipment room, but she spotted him coming and disappeared into a service elevator before he could reach her. The doors closed on his frustrated expression, leaving him standing alone in an empty hallway with his hair still damp from practice sweat. Theo drove to Cafe Clutch feeling lost and desperate, like someone who'd been cut loose from his anchor without warning. He needed advice from someone who understood complicated relationships, someone who might have insight into why Grace had shut him out so completely. He definitely hadn't expected to find Vanessa Quinn sitting alone in a corner booth looking like she was having her own complicated relationship crisis. Vanessa had her laptop open and a half-empty latte cooling beside it, but she was staring out the window with the expression of someone whose thoughts were miles away from whatever was on her screen. She looked polished as always, black hair and a sleek ponytail, professional blazer over dark jeans, but there was something vulnerable in her posture that Theo rarely saw during team meetings. Without really thinking about it, Theo slid into the booth across from her. "How do you prove to someone you're serious when they think you're just messing around?" he blurted out, watching Vanessa's eyebrows rise with sharp interest over her coffee cup. "Well, hello to you too, Theo." Vanessa closed her laptop with deliberate precision. "I take it this isn't about hockey strategy. It's about Grace." Theo ran his hands through his hair, probably making it stick up in weird directions. "She thinks I leaked that video of me talking about her. She thinks our whole relationship was fake, like I was just using her for content or whatever. And I can't figure out how to convince her that's not true when she won't even look at me." Vanessa leaned back in her seat, studying him with the kind of analytical attention she usually reserved for post-game interviews. "Tell me about the video." So Theo explained everything, the mistletoe kiss that turned into something real, the weeks of sneaking around, the way Grace had fled his apartment after seeing Jace's reel. He told Vanessa about finding Victor's abandoned mic and listening to Grace's recorded confession about not knowing how to be wanted safely. He admitted to deleting the clip without telling Grace and how that secrecy had backfired spectacularly when something else leaked instead. "She left my place thinking I'd betrayed her," Theo finished, "feeling exhausted just from reliving the whole mess. And now she's avoiding me like I have the plague. I don't know how to fix this." Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her latte cup like she was drawing warmth from it. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but brutally honest. "You're not a joke, Theo. You just act like one when it matters, and now she can't tell the difference." The words hit like a physical slap, making Theo flinch backward in his seat. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you've spent months hiding your real feelings behind jokes and casual flirtation," Vanessa said, leaning forward with unexpected gentleness. "You trained Grace to see you as unserious, so of course she doesn't believe you could want something real with her. When you're always performing, people stop looking for the person underneath the act." Theo stared at her, feeling like someone had just rearranged his entire understanding of the past few months. She was right. He'd been treating his feelings for Grace like another punchline, another bit of team entertainment. Even when they were alone together, he'd deflected serious conversations with humor, made jokes instead of admitting how much she meant to him. He'd been so afraid of being vulnerable that he'd convinced Grace he was incapable of sincerity. "If you want her to see you differently," Vanessa continued, "you have to show her who you really are when the cameras aren't rolling. Stop performing and start being honest. But fair warning, that's terrifying for people like us." "People like us?" Vanessa's smile was rueful. "People who've learned that being charming is safer than being real. People who hide behind professional personas because actual intimacy feels too risky." She paused, looking down at her latte. "Trust me, I know what I'm talking about." There was something in her voice that made Theo suspect Vanessa wasn't just talking about his situation with Grace, but he didn't push. Instead, he sat there processing her advice and feeling like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. Grace hadn't been rejecting him, she'd been protecting herself from someone she thought would never take her seriously. How do I prove I'm serious when she won't even be in the same room as me? Theo asked. You'll figure it out. Vanessa reopened her laptop, signaling the end of their impromptu therapy session. But whatever you do, make it real. No jokes, no deflection, no hiding behind that ridiculous sense of humor. If you want Grace to believe you, you have to let her see the version of yourself that you've been keeping locked away. Theo thanked Vanessa and left Cafe Clutch with his head spinning, her words echoing in his mind as he drove back to Keller Arena. The building was mostly empty by now, just security guards and the overnight cleaning crew, but Theo had left his gear bag in the locker room and needed to grab it before heading home. He was walking past the media office when he spotted something that made him stop cold. Grace's Cupmas binder sat abandoned on a shelf near the window, its familiar pastel tabs looking forlorn and forgotten. The binder she'd carried everywhere for weeks, the one that had become an extension of her organizational system, was sitting there like she'd discarded it along with any hope of working things out. Theo pushed open the office door and picked up the binder, running his fingers over the worn cover. It felt wrong to see it abandoned here, like finding a piece of Grace herself left behind. He flipped through the pages looking for clues about transfer paperwork or exit timelines, anything that might tell him if Grace was planning to leave the Vipers entirely. The binder was still meticulously organized, full of schedules and contact lists and backup plans for every possible Cupmas catastrophe. But tucked between the pages near the back, Theo found something that made his heart stop. A handwritten sticky note in Grace's careful script, "Don't fall for the guy with the lights in his sweater." The note was obviously old. The adhesive had started to curl at the edges and the ink looked faded. Grace had written it weeks ago, probably right after their first awkward encounter during Cupmas prep, as a reminder to herself to stay professional and keep her distance. She'd been fighting her feelings for him from the very beginning, trying to protect herself from exactly what had ended up happening. Theo sank into the nearest chair, holding the binder and Grace's prophetic warning, finally understanding the full scope of what he'd lost. Grace hadn't been difficult or cold or unreasonable. She'd been scared. She'd seen him coming from a mile away, the charming player with the easy smile and the habit of treating everything like a joke, and she'd tried to save herself from getting hurt by someone she thought would never take her seriously. But she'd fallen for him anyway, despite her better judgment and all her careful planning, and when everything blew up, Grace believed she'd been proven right about trusting someone like him. Theo closed the binder with new resolve, Vanessa's words still ringing in his ears. He couldn't let Grace leave believing she was just a joke to him. Couldn't let her transfer away thinking their relationship had been fake when it was the realest thing he'd ever experienced. The guy in the ridiculous sweater had been completely, desperately serious about Grace Whitby from the very beginning. Now he just had to figure out how to prove it to the one person who mattered most without hiding behind a single joke.
Chapter 13, Hismus Lights and Second Chances. The podium felt like a stage for her own execution, the bright lights overhead beating down with the intensity of an interrogation room. Grace gripped her printed remarks with white knuckles, the paper edges already softening from the dampness of her palms as she watched the crowd of Viper staff, players, and volunteers settle into their seats for what Mira had cheerfully dubbed the Cupmas wrap-up celebration. The folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor with sharp, grating sounds that made Grace's teeth ache. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to deliver her professional swan song while surrounded by glittery decorations that caught the fluorescent lights like tiny accusations and the faint smell of leftover holiday cookies that turned her stomach with their cloying sweetness. She'd already submitted her transfer paperwork that morning, the forms printed on crisp white paper that felt like surrender between her fingers. By next week, she'd be working with the team's community outreach department, still technically employed by the Vipers organization, but far enough removed from media duties that she'd never have to see Theo in a ridiculous sweater again, never have to pretend that his laugh did make her chest flutter like trapped birds, or that his terrible jokes weren't the highlight of her carefully scheduled days. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it made her chest feel hollow, like someone had scooped out everything vital and left her with just the professional shell she'd worked so hard to maintain. Thank you all for gathering tonight to celebrate the success of our holiday engagement initiatives, Grace began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands that made the papers rustle like autumn leaves. The microphone amplified every breath, every slight waver in her tone. The metrics from our Cupmas campaign exceeded all projections, with social media engagement up 47% and fan participation reaching record levels. The words felt like sawdust in her mouth, dry and tasteless and wrong. She was reading statistics about the most emotionally devastating period of her professional life, reducing weeks of stolen glances and secret touches to numbers on a spreadsheet. Every percentage point represented a moment when Theo had made her laugh despite herself. Every engagement metric, a memory of his fingers brushing hers as he handed her coffee, or the way he looked at her during those quiet moments between takes. I want to thank the entire team for their collaborative spirit and creative energy, Grace continued, forcing herself to make eye contact with various faces in the crowd, even though each gaze felt like a small judgment. Mira beamed at her from the front row, her sequin cardigan catching the light as she practically bounced in her seat, completely oblivious to the fact that Grace was essentially delivering her own eulogy. Jace gave her a thumbs up from behind his camera, his expression focused and professional, probably already editing tomorrow's social contents in his head while she systematically dismantled her own heart in public. Grace was halfway through her prepared remarks about cross, platform, synergy, the corporate buzzwords feeling foreign on her tongue when movement at the edge of the crowd caught her attention. Her breath caught in her throat like a physical thing, sharp and painful, as Theo appeared near the back of the room, pushing through the gathered staff with purposeful strides that parted the crowd like he was magnetic north and they were all just scattered compass needles. He was wearing the sweater, not just any sweater, the exact hiss-miss cheer monstrosity that had started this entire mess months ago, the green wool nightmare with the blinky reindeer nose, and strategically placed jingle bells that had made her laugh despite herself during their first awkward photo shoot. The sweater she'd specifically told herself not to find charming on the man who wore it with such ridiculous confidence, the one that had become synonymous in her mind with everything she was trying so desperately to forget. Grace's carefully prepared words died on her lips as their eyes met across the room, her throat closing around the corporate phrases she'd practiced in the mirror that morning. Theo's expression was more serious than she'd ever seen it, despite the festive chaos happening across his chest and blinking red lights. There was no hint of his usual easy grin, no self-deprecating joke lurking behind his dark eyes. He looked like a man on a mission, determined and focused in a way that made her pulse quicken with something between hope and terror. The crowd began to murmur with confusion as Theo continued walking straight toward the podium, ignoring the surprised looks from his teammates and the way people had to step aside to let him pass. Grace stood frozen, her speech forgotten, watching him move through the room like he was cutting through water. Her hands trembled as he climbed the small platform, the sound of his shoes on the metal steps echoing in the suddenly quiet room, and gently took the microphone from her nerveless fingers. Sorry to interrupt, Theo said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room, warm and familiar and exactly the sound she'd been trying so hard to forget. But I have something important to say before Grace finishes. The murmuring grew louder, a mix of confusion and anticipation rippling through the audience like waves. Grace could see Mira in the front row practically vibrating with excitement, her manicured nails tapping against her phone screen as she aimed it toward the podium. Jace had his camera trained on them, his usual casual demeanor shifting to something more invested, like he finally understood he was capturing something significant instead of just another team event. Grace wanted to disappear, to sink through the platform and emerge somewhere safe and quiet where she could process this moment without an audience. Wanted to grab the microphone back and finish her sanitized remarks about successful brand partnerships and measurable outcomes. Wanted to flee before Dio could say whatever he was about to say that would make leaving even harder than it already was, that would crack the careful walls she'd spent weeks building around her heart. But she couldn't move, could barely breathe, could only stand there beside him, close enough to smell his familiar cologne, something warm and woodsy that she'd unconsciously associated with safety, and see the way his jaw was set with determination, the muscles there tight with resolve. Theo looked directly at Grace as he spoke into the microphone, his voice steady despite the blinking reindeer nose that kept flashing between them like a tiny beacon. "I'm not always good at being serious when it matters," he said, each word deliberate and clear. "I make jokes instead of admissions, wear ridiculous sweaters instead of my heart on my sleeve, and I let the most incredible woman I've ever met think she was just a joke to me." Grace's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them, the salt sting immediate and overwhelming. The room had gone completely silent except for the faint jingle of Theo's sweater bells with each breath and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ear so loudly she was sure the microphone would pick it up. Theo's voice got stronger as he continued, more confident with each word, like he was finally saying things he'd been holding back for months. "But Grace Whitby is the least funny thing that's ever happened to me. She's brilliant and organized, and she color codes her feelings because she's brave enough to try to understand them, unlike me." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the honesty in his voice and the way he was saying all of this in front of everyone. Teammates who would tease him mercilessly, staff members who would gossip about it for months, people with cameras who would probably post clips of this moment before they even left the building. Theo was putting himself completely on display, vulnerable in a way that went far beyond any ridiculous sweater, stripping away all the humor and deflection that usually protected him. "I don't know if she'll forgive me for being an idiot," the host said, his eyes never leaving Grace's face, searching her expression like he was trying to read her thoughts. "But I know I love her binders and her emergency donuts and the way she pretends not to smile at my terrible sweaters, and I'm tired of pretending that's not the most serious thing in the world to me." The room had gone so quiet, Grace could hear the click of Jace's camera shutter and the soft whir of Mira's phone recording, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead, but all she could focus on was Theo's earnest face, the way he was finally being completely honest in front of everyone who mattered. This wasn't a performance or a joke or another one of his charming deflections designed to make people laugh and move on. This was raw, real, messy, imperfect, and entirely hers if she was brave enough to reach out and take it. Grace stared at him for one long, breathless moment, processing the weight of what he just said and the incredible courage it had taken him to say it. The man who hid behind humor and treated everything like a game had just laid his heart bare in front of a room full of people, knowing it might be broadcast across social media before the night was over, knowing he was risking everything for the possibility that she might feel the same way. Without thinking about professional consequences or transfer paperwork or what anyone would say, without consulting her color-coded contingency plans or weighing the pros and cons, Grace stepped forward and kissed him. She kissed him right there at the podium, pouring months of suppressed feelings into the contact, her hands fisting in the ridiculous wool of his sweater as she pressed against him. The fabric was softer than she'd expected, warm from his body heat and slightly scratchy against her palms. She kissed him like she'd wanted to every time he'd made her laugh, every time he'd looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the room, every time he'd been gentle with her fears instead of dismissive of them. Theo dropped the microphone with a feedback squeal that made half the room wince and cover their ears, but Grace barely noticed because his arms were wrapping around her, lifting her slightly off her feet as he kissed her back with the same desperate intensity. She could feel his smile against her lips as the crowd erupted in cheers and surprised laughter, could hear someone starting to chant mistletoe, even though there wasn't a sprig of mistletoe anywhere near them, just the memory of where this all started. The kiss lasted longer than it should have in front of an audience, but Grace didn't care. She'd been pretending not to want this for months, denying herself the simplest touches and stolen moments, and now that she was finally letting herself have it, she wasn't ready to stop. Theo's hands were warm against her back, his touch careful but certain. Like he still couldn't quite believe she was choosing this, choosing him, choosing to make herself vulnerable in front of everyone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and grinning at each other like teenagers who just discovered kissing, Grace glanced over Theo's shoulder to see Victor the Viper in the back of the crowd. The oversized green mascot was raising both foam fists in triumph, like he'd been orchestrating this entire romance from the beginning, which Grace was starting to suspect might actually be true, given his uncanny ability to appear at every significant moment in their relationship. The thought made her laugh, a sound that bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest and refused to be contained. She was standing on a podium in front of half the Vipers organization, having just kissed a hockey player wearing a blinking sweater, and instead of the mortification she should be feeling, she felt lighter than she had in weeks, like she'd been carrying a weight she didn't realize was there until it was gone. Grace reached for the microphone with shaking hands, feedback squealing briefly as she adjusted it and tried to find her voice again. The room was still buzzing with excitement and scattered applause, people talking over each other in animated whispers, and phones capturing every angle of what would undoubtedly become the most watched Vipers content of the season. I guess my transfer paperwork can wait, Grace announced, her voice carrying over the chaos, stronger and more certain than she'd sounded all evening. The room erupted again, louder this time, with whoops and cheers, and what sounded like Mira practically shrieking with joy from the front row. Theo kept his arm around Grace's waist, both of them laughing as the crowd dissolved into celebratory chaos, and she could hear Mira already planning what she vowed she was calling the Hismus engagement party, whether they liked it or not. "We're not engaged," Grace said into the microphone, still grinning so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yet," Mira called back from the audience, causing another round of laughter and a few scattered wolf whistles from the younger players. Grace looked up at Theo, who was beaming down at her with an expression of pure happiness and relief, like he'd been holding his breath for months and could finally exhale. The blinking reindeer nose on his sweater cast intermittent red light across his face, making him look ridiculous and perfect and entirely hers in a way that made her chest tight with possibility. "Nice sweater," she said, just loud enough for the microphone to pick up. The same words she'd said to him during that first photo shoot when she'd been trying so hard to maintain professional distance. "Thanks," Theo replied, his voice warm with laughter and something deeper, more tender. "I wore it just for you." The crowd cheered again, and Grace realized she was probably going to have to get used to being part of the story instead of just documenting it from behind her camera and clipboard. The thought should have terrified her control freak sensibilities, should have sent her reaching for contingency plans and damage control strategies. But with Theo's arm around her and his ridiculous sweater blinking cheerfully against the bright lights, with the sound of genuine celebration filling the air around them, terror was the furthest thing from her mind. For the first time in months, Grace Whitby was exactly where she wanted to be, as the couple chaos. Grace had faced difficult situations before, presentation meltdowns, equipment failures, even the time Victor the Viper had somehow gotten stuck in a photo backdrop during a live stream. But sitting behind a convention center table with her fan panel emergency kit binder open while hundreds of Vipers fans filed into the auditorium felt like a uniquely specialized form of torture. The moderator, a perky woman with a clipboard and an alarming amount of enthusiasm, had cheerfully introduced the event as Behind the Bench Holiday Highlights, but Grace privately thought of it as public interrogation about my love life. She'd mentally rehearsed professional responses to personal questions for the better part of a week, color-coded her emergency conversation redirects, and even packed backup water bottles in case her throat went dry mid-panic. None of that preparation seemed particularly useful now that she was actually here, watching the auditorium fill with eager faces and phone cameras, all pointed directly at the panel table where she was trying not to hyperventilate. The York, naturally, lounged comfortably in the chair beside her, like he'd been born for this exact moment. He was wearing yet another holiday sweater, this one featuring a hockey-playing snowman, complete with tiny knitted stick, and somehow managing to look both relaxed and charming, despite the fact that they were about to be grilled by an audience of people who'd been analyzing their relationship like a particularly engaging soap opera. Grace clutched her water bottle like a lifeline and tried to channel the same easy confidence Theo radiated, but mostly she just felt like she was going to throw up on the convention center carpeting. "You okay?" Theo murmured, leaning slightly toward her as the moderator did a final microphone check. "Define okay," Grace whispered back, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Because if okay means prepared to discuss my personal life in front of 300 strangers, then absolutely not." Lee's smile was warm and reassuring, the kind of expression that made her remember why she'd fallen for him in the first place. Hey, worst case scenario, Victor shows up and creates a distraction. He's got a sixth sense for inappropriate timing. Before Grace could respond, the moderator tapped her microphone and beamed at the crowd. "Good afternoon, Vipers fans. We're so excited to have Grace Whitby, our incredible media coordinator, and Theo Bianchi, left-wing extraordinaire, here to talk about the holiday season that gave us all the content we never knew we needed." The audience erupted in cheers and applause, and Grace felt her face heat as phones lifted throughout the crowd, clearly ready to capture every embarrassing moment of the next hour. Let's start with some behind the scenes questions, the moderator continued, consulting her notes. Grace, can you walk us through the logistics of planning something as elaborate as the Cupmas party? I'm sure event planning fans would love to hear about your process. Grace straightened in her chair, grateful for a question she could actually answer without wanting to disappear into the floor. Well, it really starts with understanding your audience and your venue constraints, she began, falling into the familiar rhythm of professional presentation mode. For Cupmas, we knew we wanted something that felt festive but not overly formal, interactive but not chaotic. How did you choose the mistletoe roulette concept? A voice called from the middle section, and Grace felt her carefully constructed professional composure waver slightly. That was actually Mira's idea, Grace said, shooting a grateful look toward the wings where she could see Mira giving her an encouraging thumbs up. She wanted something that would encourage team bonding while also creating engaging social content. Did you test it beforehand? Another fan asked, and Grace could hear the barely contained excitement in the question. We did a few trial runs, Grace admitted, remembering the practice spin that had nearly resulted in her first kiss with Theo weeks before the actual party, just to make sure the wheel mechanism worked properly. She could see the fans shifting restlessly in their seats, clearly waiting for someone to ask what they really wanted to know. The softball questions about planning logistics were fine, but Grace could practically feel the anticipation radiating from the audience as they waited for the conversation to turn to what everyone actually cared about. A teenage girl in a Vipers jersey raised her hand, and Grace felt her stomach drop even before the question left the girl's mouth. Was it really random at Mistletoe Roulette? The girl asked, her voice carrying clearly over the PA system. Or did you guys plan it? Grace felt her face heat as every camera in the room swiveled toward her. But before she could formulate a response that walked the line between honest and professional, Theo leaned forward with an easy grin. Trust me, he said, his voice warm with amusement and something deeper. Nothing about falling for Grace was planned. The audience erupted in delighted cheers and ahs, and Grace felt her carefully maintained composure crumble slightly as Theo's words hit her with the same force they'd had the first time he'd said something similar. He wasn't just playing to the crowd. There was genuine affection in his voice, the kind of sincerity that made her chest tight with possibility. When did you know it was real? Someone called from the back, and Grace watched Theo consider the question with the same thoughtful attention he gave game strategy. Honestly, Theo said, glancing at Grace with a smile that made her forget they were sitting in front of hundreds of people, probably when she showed up to chew me out about that leaked clip. She was so mad, so passionate about it, and all I could think was that I didn't want to be on the receiving end of that anger. I wanted to be on the same side as her. Who said I love you first? Another fan shouted, and Grace felt herself sink lower in her chair as the questions escalated beyond anything her emergency binder could have prepared her for. Can you recreate the kiss? Someone else called, causing a wave of laughter and cheers to ripple through the audience. Grace watched Theo field each question with easy charm, somehow managing to be both honest and entertaining without making her feel exposed or uncomfortable. He had a gift for turning potentially invasive questions into opportunities for gentle humor, deflecting the more intrusive inquiries while still giving the fans enough genuine content to satisfy their curiosity. The kiss stays private, Theo said with a grin that suggested he was half tempted to comply with the request, but I will say that Grace is much better at it than she is at cupcake decorating. Grace protested, finally finding her voice again as the audience laughed. That was sabotage and you know it. Someone switched my icing tips. Joe, Theo said, winking at the crowd, blamed the equipment. Grace felt herself relaxing slightly, despite the continued attention, drawn into the familiar rhythm of their banter. This was easier than she'd expected. When she stopped trying to maintain perfect professional distance and just let herself be present with Theo, the whole thing felt less like an interrogation and more like an extension of their normal dynamic. A fan in the back called out, cutting through the laughter, with a question that made Grace's blood go cold. What would you have done if that clip hadn't leaked and exposed everything? The auditorium went quiet, hundreds of faces turning toward Grace with expectant attention. It was the question she'd been dreading, the one that forced her to confront her own cowardice and the careful walls she'd built around her feelings. She could deflect it, redirect to safer ground, stick to the professional responses she'd rehearsed. Instead, Grace looked at the expectant crowd, then at Theo's encouraging smile, and decided to be honest. I probably would have talked myself out of it, she said, her voice carrying clearly over the suddenly silent auditorium. I was so scared of messing up my career that I would have convinced myself it was better to stay safe and alone. The audience shifted forward with rapt attention, phones held steady to capture every word. Grace could feel her heart beating too fast, but for once the vulnerability didn't feel terrifying. It felt necessary. Getting exposed taught me that the worst thing wasn't people knowing I had feelings, Grace continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. It was pretending I didn't when those feelings were the best thing that ever happened to me. And apparently management agreed. They rejected my transfer request before I could even officially withdraw it. Something about being too valuable to the current media team dynamic. The crowd erupted in cheers and ahs that seemed to echo off the convention center walls, and Grace felt Theo squeeze her hand under the table as she added, "So thank you to whoever leaked that clip, because without it, I'd still be hiding behind my binder tabs instead of sitting here with him." The applause was thunderous, and Grace felt something loosen in her chest as she realized she'd just shared her deepest fear with hundreds of strangers and somehow felt lighter for it. The phones didn't seem threatening anymore. They felt like witnesses to something real and important, a moment she was proud to have captured. Just as the applause began to die down, the side door of the auditorium burst open with a dramatic flourish that could only mean one thing. Victor the Viper crashed through the entrance wearing a glittery sash that read "Best Man" in sequin letters, causing the audience to roar with laughter as he wadded toward the panel table with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for championship victories. His foam head bobbed with each step, and Grace could see camera flashes going off throughout the crowd as fans scrambled to capture the unexpected appearance. Victor struck a pose at the edge of the table, one foam claw pressed to his chest in a gesture of theatrical emotion, before producing a sparkling envelope from somewhere in his oversized jersey. The envelope was labeled Engagement RSVP, Manifest Edition, in glittery script that caught the stage lights as he presented it to Grace and Theo with a flourish that would have made a game show host proud. Grace dissolved into laughter as she accepted the envelope, her earlier nerves completely forgotten in the face of Victor's perfect timing and shameless drama. She could feel Theo shaking with suppressed laughter beside her as she opened the sparkly envelope to reveal a card decorated with tiny hearts and hockey sticks. "The fans have spoken," Grace read aloud, her voice bubbling with amusement. "Wedding content required for maximum engagement metrics." The audience roared its approval, and Grace felt Theo pull her closer as he leaned toward his microphone. "Victor is jumping the gun," Theo said, his voice warm with laughter and affection. "But when the time comes, you'll all be the first to know." From somewhere off camera, Jace's voice carried clearly over the PA system. "Ugh, they're disgusting. I love it." Grace leaned back in her chair, still laughing as Victor took a bow and the audience continued cheering. For the first time since she'd walked into the convention center, she felt completely at ease. This wasn't about perfect professional presentation or carefully managed public image. It was about sharing something real with people who genuinely cared about their happiness. Looking out at the sea of delighted faces and raised phones, Grace realized she wasn't scared anymore. She was part of the story now, and that felt exactly right.
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.